Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. Story 1. The monks who measured sleep in spoonfuls of poppy. If you imagine medicine in the early Middle Ages, you might picture crude surgery, superstition, or whispered prayers over the sick. And all of that certainly existed. But if you walk slowly through the imagined corridors of a European monastery sometime around the 9th century, you would find something quieter, something slower, something surprisingly methodical. You're standing inside a stone building where the walls keep the air cool even in summer. Outside, there is the soft sound of wind moving through herb gardens carefully planted by the monks. Inside, in a small room near the infirmary, glass jars sit on wooden shelves. They contain dried leaves, seeds, and powders gathered over years. Among them is a jar filled with something pale and granular. Poppy. Not the bright red flowers themselves, but the dried sap that can be extracted from them. In the medieval world, long before laboratories and pharmaceutical companies, this substance was one of the few reliable ways to dull pain or bring sleep. And in many monasteries, it was treated with quiet seriousness. Monks were not supposed to pursue intoxication. Their lives were meant to be structured around prayer, labor, and discipline. Yet they were also responsible for caring for the sick, not only their fellow monks, but sometimes travelers, pilgrims, and villagers who came seeking help. So they became some of the most careful medical record keepers of their age. Inside certain monastery libraries, you would find copies of ancient texts preserved from earlier civilizations. Among them were works attributed to physicians like Hippocrates and Galen, whose writings survived because monks patiently copied them by hand century after century. These texts described plants that could relieve pain or induce sleep. Poppy was one of the most notable. The plant itself, Papaver somniferum, had been known for thousands of years. Ancient societies in places like Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt had already discovered that the milky sap inside the poppy pod contained powerful effects. In medieval Europe, however, knowledge traveled slowly. Recipes were often fragmented, measurements were uncertain, and the line between medicine and poison was thin. So in the monastery infirmary, caution became a habit. A monk responsible for the medicine cabinet might grind dried poppy into powder and mix it with honey or wine. The resulting liquid was sometimes called a sleeping draught, but the dosage was rarely written as we might expect today. There were no milligrams. Instead, instructions might read something like, "Take a spoonful before the night bell." The spoon itself was not standardized. It depended on the monastery kitchen. Sometimes the instruction was even more vague. A small portion, enough to quiet the pain but not the spirit. You might imagine the monk standing beside a sick brother late at night, holding a small wooden spoon filled with cloudy liquid. Outside, the bells mark the passing hours of prayer matins, lauds, and vespers, while inside the room the patient slowly drifts towards sleep. It was a simple act, but one that carried risk. Too little poppy and the patient would remain awake, suffering. Too much and the breathing could slow dangerously. Yet despite the risks, these early sedatives were sometimes the best relief available in a harsh world. Life in the Middle Ages involved constant physical pain. Laborers worked fields with primitive tools. Soldiers returned from wars with untreated wounds. Tooth decay was common, infections frequent. Even something as simple as a broken bone could become a life-threatening ordeal. Monasteries became quiet refuges for these problems. In places like Monte Cassino, gardens were planted with medicinal herbs, sage, fennel, mint, and poppies among them. The monks followed the traditions of Benedict of Nursia, whose rule encouraged both scholarship and practical care for the sick. The garden itself was a place of quiet routine. You can imagine walking there early in the morning. Dew clings to the leaves. A monk bends over a row of poppies, gently inspecting the swelling pods where the valuable sap forms. Harvesting them required patience. The pod would be lightly scored with a small blade. Overnight, a milky latex would seep out and dry into a sticky residue. The next day it could be scraped off and collected. This was crude opium, though the monks did not use that word. To them, it was simply a preparation derived from poppy. The collected material was sometimes mixed with other ingredients. Wine was common. Honey was used to preserve it. Herbs like henbane or mandrake might occasionally be added, though those plants were far more dangerous. Every mixture represented a small experiment, and the monks were aware of it. Many medical manuscripts from the Middle Ages include warnings about poppy. Some note that it should only be given to those in great pain. Others caution against giving it to the elderly or the very young. These early doctors did not fully understand why the substance worked, but they could observe patterns. Too much caused sleep so deep it resembled death. Too little did nothing at all. So they wrote notes in margins. They added comments to manuscripts. Over generations, small bits of knowledge accumulated like sediment in a river. And slowly, a medieval pharmacology began to take shape. The strange part is that these discoveries happened in places defined by silence. Monasteries were structured around time. A monk might wake before sunrise for prayer, work in the gardens, or copy manuscripts during the day, eat simple meals of bread, vegetables, and beer. And throughout it all, the bells guided every movement. Within this routine, the preparation of medicines became almost meditative. Grinding herbs, measuring powders, heating mixtures slowly over a small flame. Nothing about it was dramatic, yet the impact could be profound. A wounded traveler might arrive at the monastery gate late in the evening. Perhaps he had walked for days with an infected injury. The monks would wash the wound, wrap it in cloth, and offer a cup containing a mild poppy mixture. For the first time in days, the traveler might sleep. That alone could feel miraculous. But poppy was not the only plant used in these sleepy preparations. Medieval medicine often combined several sedatives into what later historians sometimes call the spongia somnifera, or sleeping sponge. This was exactly what it sounds like. A sponge soaked in a mixture of wine, poppy, mandrake, and other herbs would be dried and stored. When needed, it could be moistened and held near a patient's nose, allowing them to inhale the vapors. It was one of the earliest forms of anesthesia. The effectiveness varied wildly. Sometimes it worked surprisingly well, other times it did almost nothing. But in an era before modern chemistry, even a partial dulling of pain could make surgery possible. And surgery in those centuries was terrifying. Bones needed to be set, abscesses drained, arrows removed from flesh. Without some form of sedation, the patient might thrash or scream or faint from shock. So the poppy preparations continued to circulate through monastic medicine. Recipes traveled slowly across Europe through handwritten books. One manuscript might begin its journey in Salerno, home of an early medical school, before being copied again in a monastery hundreds of miles away. Each copy added new details, a different measurement, a warning scribbled in the margin, a monk's personal observation about how long the sleep lasted. If you could gather all those manuscripts together today, you would see a centuries-long conversation about pain and relief, written quietly by people who never imagined their notes would survive into the modern world. Yet those notes also reveal something else. Even in the Middle Ages, people were aware that substances like poppy could blur the line between medicine and indulgence. There are scattered references to monks who took too much. Others were warned not to use sleeping draughts unless necessary. Some abbots even restricted access to the strongest preparations. Because once you discover a plant that quiets the mind and softens pain, the temptation to use it more often becomes difficult to ignore. And that raises a quiet question that lingered in medieval medicine. A question the monks themselves rarely answered directly. If a spoonful of poppy could bring peaceful sleep on a painful night, how many spoonfuls would it take before sleep turned into something else entirely? If you remain inside the monastery a little longer, perhaps walking slowly through the library where the air smells faintly of parchment and candle wax, you would begin to notice something curious about medieval medicine. Knowledge moved very slowly, but once it began moving, it could travel astonishing distances. A medical recipe written by one monk in southern Europe might, over the course of 2 centuries, find its way to a monastery hundreds or even thousands of kilometers away. Each step of that journey happened quietly, through the careful copying of manuscripts by hand. You might imagine a monk sitting at a wooden desk in the late afternoon. Outside, the light fades through narrow stone windows. Before him lies a manuscript originally written generations earlier. With a quill and ink, he copies each line carefully. Among the prayers, agricultural instructions, and philosophical texts, there are also medical recipes. Some are simple, almost humble in their instructions. Take crushed poppy and mix with warm wine. Others are far more elaborate. One surviving recipe from medieval Europe instructs the reader to combine poppy, mandrake, henbane, and lettuce seeds, simmering them gently before soaking a sponge in the liquid. The sponge would later be used to induce sleep before surgery. This mixture, often referred to by later historians as the sleeping sponge, appears in several manuscripts associated with the medical traditions of Salerno. During the Middle Ages, Salerno was home to one of Europe's earliest organized centers of medical learning, the Scola Medica Salernitana. What makes Salerno particularly interesting is that it sat at the crossroads of cultures. Greek medical traditions preserved from the Roman world met Arabic scholarship, arriving through trade and translation. Latin monks, Jewish physicians, and Muslim scholars all contributed pieces of knowledge to the growing body of medical writing. Among the ancient authorities frequently quoted in these texts was Dioscorides, whose 1st century book De Materia Medica cataloged hundreds of medicinal plants. Poppy appears there as well, not described as a recreational substance, but as something practical, a plant that could quiet coughing, relieve pain, and bring sleep. Medieval monks treated such texts with deep respect. They copied them faithfully, but they also added small observations from their own experience. Sometimes these notes were surprisingly practical. One manuscript warns that poppy mixtures should be given only in the evening, because sleep is the purpose of the plant. Another suggests adding honey to soften the bitterness, making it easier for sick patients to swallow. These additions reveal something about how medicine actually functioned during the Middle Ages. It was not purely theoretical. It was shaped by trial and error, and sometimes the results were unsettling. For example, mandrake, a plant frequently mixed with poppy and medieval sedatives, had an especially eerie reputation. Its root often grows in shapes that vaguely resemble the human body, with 2 branching legs and a thicker upper portion. Because of this, medieval folklore claimed the plant could scream when pulled from the ground. The belief became so widespread that some herbal manuals described elaborate harvesting rituals. One method involved tying the root to a dog with a rope, then allowing the animal to pull the plant from the earth while the human stood at a safe distance. The dog, according to legend, would die from the plant's deadly scream. Of course, the story was almost certainly myth, but the plant itself was very real. Mandrake contains natural compounds that can cause sedation, confusion, and hallucinations. Combined with poppy, the effects could become powerful and unpredictable. This unpredictability explains why medieval medical texts repeatedly warn readers to use these plants sparingly. But warnings do not always prevent experimentation. In fact, monasteries unintentionally became places where small medical experiments happened regularly. When a sick traveler arrived, the monks might try a preparation described in a manuscript copied decades earlier. If the patient improved, the monk might add a note in the margin. This mixture works well. If the result was less successful, the comment might be more cautious. Use a smaller portion. Or simply, dangerous if taken too often. These quiet annotations gradually formed a practical medical tradition. You could think of it as a slow conversation across centuries. A monk in France might copy a manuscript originally written in Italy. A century later, another monk in England might add a new herbal ingredient grown in northern climates. The result was a patchwork of knowledge. And poppy appeared again and again within it. The reason was simple: it worked. Even crude preparations of poppy sap contain compounds that affect the human nervous system. The monks did not know about chemicals like morphine, which would only be isolated centuries later. But they could observe the outcome. A person in pain drank a small amount. Soon afterward, their breathing slowed, their body relaxed, and sleep followed. In an age where most illnesses offered little comfort, that effect was valuable. Yet it also raised uncomfortable questions inside monastic communities. Monks were supposed to live disciplined lives. Excess was discouraged. Intoxication was frowned upon. So how should they think about a substance that blurred the line between medicine and pleasure? The answer was usually framed in moral language. A sleeping draught taken for illness was acceptable. Taking it simply to escape daily life was not. This distinction appears repeatedly in medieval religious writings. Some abbots warned that medicines affecting the mind should only be used under supervision. In other words, even 1,000 years ago, there was an awareness that certain substances could be misused. But enforcement was difficult. Monasteries were large communities. Some housed dozens of monks, others contained hundreds. Not everyone followed the rules perfectly. Occasionally, records hint at monks who developed unusual attachments to the infirmary supplies. One chronicler wrote about a brother who frequently complained of headaches late in the evening, always just before the time when sleeping draughts might be distributed. Another record describes an abbot ordering that certain medicinal jars remain locked unless the infirmarian was present. These small details suggest that medieval people understood something about dependency, even if they lacked modern vocabulary for it. Still, most of the time, the poppy mixtures served exactly the purpose intended: to help people endure pain. Consider the experience of surgery in the medieval world. Without effective sedation, procedures were brutal. Patients were often held down by assistants while surgeons worked quickly with knives or saws. Speed mattered more than precision. Anything that could dull awareness, even slightly, changed the situation. So when monks prepared mixtures of poppy and wine, they were participating in a medical practice that stretched back thousands of years. Interestingly, similar preparations existed in other parts of the world at the same time. In the medieval Islamic world, physicians developed complex medical theories based on earlier Greek texts, but expanded with new experimentation. Scholars like Avicenna wrote detailed medical encyclopedias describing sedative plants and their careful use. His famous work, The Canon of Medicine, included descriptions of opium preparations used to calm pain and induce sleep. Through translation movements in places like Toledo, these Arabic medical texts eventually reached European scholars. And when they did, they reinforced something medieval monks already suspected. The poppy was powerful, too powerful perhaps to treat casually. But even as knowledge about the plant grew, one fundamental problem remained unsolved: dosage. Without modern instruments, measurements were inconsistent. A spoonful might vary dramatically depending on the kitchen utensil available. The strength of the poppy sap could also vary depending on soil, weather, and harvest timing. One batch might be mild, another could be dangerously potent. And so medieval medicine remained cautious, sometimes almost timid, when using these preparations. Patients were watched carefully after taking them. If breathing slowed too much, the monks might try to wake the sleeper with strong smells like vinegar or burning herbs. Most of the time, the patient eventually awoke. But not always. A few grim notes appear in certain manuscripts, brief, almost apologetic lines written in the margins. Too much was given. Or simply, the brother did not wake. These quiet tragedies remind us how uncertain medieval medicine could be. The same plant that brought relief could also bring death. Yet despite the risks, the practice continued. Because in a world full of suffering from injuries, disease, and exhaustion, the promise of peaceful sleep was difficult to ignore. And slowly, across centuries of copying manuscripts and tending monastery gardens, the knowledge of poppy spread across Europe. But the monks were not the only ones discovering its power. Beyond the monastery walls, traders, travelers, and physicians were also carrying this strange sleeping plant across continents. And in some places, the poppy was beginning to be used not just as medicine, but as something else entirely. If you step back from the monastery walls now, leaving behind the quiet herb gardens and carefully labeled jars, you begin to see that the story of poppy in the medieval world did not stay confined to monks and infirmaries. The plant moved. It traveled in the saddlebags of merchants, in the handwritten pages of medical manuscripts, and in the memories of travelers who had experienced its effects. Slowly, almost invisibly, knowledge about the poppy spread outward from places of learning into the everyday life of medieval societies. And once it left the controlled environment of monasteries, it entered a far more complicated world. Throughout the Middle Ages, Europe was connected by a loose but persistent network of trade routes. Pilgrims traveled toward shrines, merchants crossed mountain passes with spices and cloth, and soldiers moved across borders during nearly constant conflicts. These travelers carried stories with them. A wounded soldier who had been given a poppy-based sleeping draught in a monastery might later describe the experience to others in a tavern. A merchant who recovered from surgery, thanks to such a preparation, might recommend it to a physician in another city. Gradually, the knowledge stopped being monastic. It became practical. In cities and towns, a new kind of medical professional began appearing: the apothecary. An apothecary's shop looked very different from a monastery infirmary, though the shelves might contain many of the same ingredients. Glass jars filled with dried herbs lined the walls. Mortars and pestles sat on wooden counters. Strange powders and oils waited to be mixed according to handwritten recipes. These shops appeared in growing numbers in medieval cities like Florence, Paris, and London. Unlike monks, apothecaries worked in busy urban environments. Customers came and went constantly. A laborer might arrive with an aching back after days of construction work. A mother might seek a remedy for a child's fever. A traveler might ask for something to help him sleep after a long journey. And sometimes the answer involved poppy. The preparations varied widely. Some were mild herbal mixtures intended only to calm restlessness. Others were stronger, closer to what earlier monastic texts had described as sleeping draughts. Apothecaries did not usually call these substances drugs. That word would develop its modern meaning much later. Instead, they referred to them as medicines, tinctures, or simply preparations. But the underlying substance was the same. The sap of the poppy plant dried, scraped, and dissolved into mixtures that could quiet pain or induce sleep. What made this period particularly interesting is that knowledge about these substances was still deeply uncertain. There were no laboratories analyzing chemical compounds. Instead, medieval medicine relied heavily on the ancient theory of bodily humors, the belief that health depended on the balance of four internal fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. This theory came largely from the writings of Galen, whose influence on medieval medicine was enormous. According to this framework, poppy preparations were thought to cool the body and calm excessive heat in the brain. They were used for sleeplessness, headaches, and severe pain. But doctors also warned that they could overcool the body, leading to weakness or even death. So once again, the same careful warnings appeared. Small amounts, only when necessary, and always with supervision. In practice, however, reality was less controlled. Urban apothecaries did not have the same quiet discipline as monastery infirmaries. Customers sometimes demanded stronger remedies. Others purchased mixtures without fully understanding their effects. Records from medieval city councils occasionally mention attempts to regulate apothecaries. One of the earliest known regulations appeared in Florence during the late Middle Ages, where local authorities began requiring apothecaries to follow standardized recipes for certain medicines. The goal was simple: prevent dangerous mixtures. But enforcement was uneven. Medieval cities were busy places filled with competing professions: physicians, surgeons, herbalists, and folk healers. Each group had its own traditions and remedies. And among them, poppy continued appearing again and again. Sometimes it appeared in an unexpectedly gentle context. For example, medieval medical texts occasionally recommend very small amounts of poppy preparations for infants who were restless or unable to sleep. These mixtures were diluted heavily with honey or milk. The intention was to calm the child. But modern historians sometimes read these instructions with unease. The margin between safe and dangerous doses was incredibly narrow, especially for young children. Yet to medieval parents, the mixture represented something comforting: a sleeping baby, a quiet night. Even in those early centuries, the poppy had already acquired its most enduring reputation. It was the plant that could silence pain. But beyond the medical world, the plant carried another quiet influence. In art and literature of the Middle Ages, poppies occasionally appear as symbols of sleep, forgetfulness, and dreams. Medieval writers inherited these associations from earlier classical traditions. In Greek mythology, sleep itself was personified by Hypnos, who was often depicted holding poppy flowers. The symbolism survived long after the original myths faded. In medieval illustrations, poppies sometimes appear near sleeping figures, representing the boundary between consciousness and rest. It is a gentle symbol, but behind it lies a complicated reality. Because the medieval world was gradually discovering something that modern societies still struggle with today. A substance that relieves suffering can also create dependence. And once knowledge of such a substance spreads beyond controlled environments, it becomes difficult to manage. For the monks who first measured poppy preparations by spoonfuls, the goal had been simple: ease pain, bring sleep, help the sick endure another day. They could not have imagined the long future ahead of the plant they cultivated in their quiet gardens. Centuries later, scientists would isolate powerful compounds from the poppy, including morphine and codeine. These substances would transform modern medicine, allowing surgeries and treatments that medieval physicians could barely imagine. Yet the same plant would also become entangled in global trade, addiction, and international conflict. All of that lay far in the future. In the medieval monastery garden, the poppies still swayed gently in the wind, their delicate petals falling away to reveal the rounded pods where the valuable sap formed. A monk might walk through the rows in the early morning, inspecting the plants as he had done many times before. To him, the poppy was not a symbol of empire or addiction. It was simply a tool, a plant that helped people sleep. And in a world where pain was common and relief was rare, that small gift must have felt deeply important. But the story of strange medieval medicines does not end with poppies. In fact, some of the most surprising remedies of the Middle Ages did not come from flowers at all. They came from kitchens, moldy bread, fermented drinks, and mixtures so strange that modern readers often struggle to believe they were taken seriously. So the question becomes, if medieval doctors were willing to use poppy sap to quiet pain, what other unexpected substances filled the medicine cabinets of the Middle Ages? And what did people actually swallow when they were desperate to feel better? Story 2. Honey, mold, and prayer, the strange medicine cabinets of medieval Europe. If you walk quietly into a medieval infirmary, perhaps sometime in the 12th century, you might expect the shelves to look mysterious and dramatic, rows of strange potions bubbling in glass bottles, or dramatic powders capable of curing any illness. But the truth is far more ordinary. In fact, if you stood in front of a typical medicine shelf in medieval Europe, many of the items would look surprisingly familiar. There would be honey. There would be herbs. There would be jars of wine or vinegar. There might even be pieces of bread. The medicine cabinets of the medieval world were not filled with rare magical substances. Most remedies were made from everyday materials that people already used in cooking, farming, or food preservation. And yet, within these simple ingredients, medieval healers sometimes stumbled upon treatments that actually worked. The problem was that they did not always understand why. To see how this worked, imagine stepping inside the infirmary of a monastery somewhere in northern Europe. The year is around 1150. Outside the stone building, fields stretch across the countryside. Inside, the air smells faintly of herbs drying on wooden racks. A monk responsible for the infirmary moves slowly between shelves, checking jars and bundles of plants tied with string. Some of these plants come from the monastery garden. Others were brought by travelers or purchased from merchants who arrived from distant places. A few ingredients might have traveled hundreds or even thousands of miles before reaching this quiet room. But most of the remedies on these shelves are surprisingly simple. Take honey, for example. In the medieval world, honey was far more than a sweetener. It was one of the most widely used medicinal substances in Europe. Beekeeping had existed for centuries. Hives were common near monasteries and farms, and the golden liquid produced by bees was considered both nourishing and protective. Medical texts from the Middle Ages often describe honey as cleansing and healing. Wounds were sometimes covered with honey-soaked cloths. Sore throats were treated with warm drinks containing honey and herbs. And occasionally, honey was used in ways that sound oddly modern. Today, medical researchers know that honey has natural antibacterial properties. Certain types of honey can slow the growth of bacteria and help wounds heal more cleanly. Medieval healers did not know about bacteria, of course. The idea of microscopic organisms would not emerge until centuries later. But they could observe results. A wound covered with honey sometimes healed better than one left untreated. So the practice continued. In fact, some of the most detailed medieval medical instructions involving honey appear in texts, associated with the medical school of Schola Medica Salernitana in Salerno. Physicians there collected and translated knowledge from Greek, Roman, and Arabic traditions, producing practical guides for treating everyday illnesses. Honey appeared again and again in those recipes. It was mixed with vinegar for sore throats, combined with herbs for digestive problems, and occasionally used as a base to preserve more fragile ingredients. Honey's thick texture made it ideal for storing powdered herbs. A mixture of crushed leaves and honey could last far longer than dry herbs alone. So jars of honey often sat at the center of the medieval medicine shelf, quietly supporting dozens of different remedies. Next to the honey jars, you might find bundles of herbs. Some were familiar culinary plants, thyme, sage, and mint. Others were stranger, gathered from forests or wetlands. Monks and herbalists relied heavily on guides derived from earlier texts like De Materia Medica by Dioscorides. Although written in the 1st century, this ancient book continued influencing European medicine for over 1,000 years. It described hundreds of plants and their supposed medicinal uses. Some recommendations were effective, others were not. But medieval healers rarely had better information available, so they relied on observation, tradition, and faith. If a remedy seemed to help someone recover, it was written down and repeated. If it failed, it might quietly disappear from practice. Sometimes this trial and error process produced surprising results. Consider mold. To a medieval person, moldy food was usually a sign that something had gone wrong. Bread left too long in damp conditions might grow fuzzy patches of green or white. Cheese sometimes developed strange blue veins. Most people tried to avoid eating such food. But in certain medical texts, moldy bread appears in wound treatments. A healer might place a small piece of moldy bread directly onto an infected cut before wrapping the wound with cloth. From a modern perspective, this sounds alarming. Yet the practice occasionally worked. Certain molds produce natural antibiotic compounds. The most famous example is penicillin, discovered centuries later by Alexander Fleming in 1928. Of course, medieval healers did not isolate penicillin or identify specific molds. Their use of moldy bread was inconsistent and unpredictable. Sometimes it helped. Other times it did nothing at all. But the fact that such treatments existed reveals something fascinating about medieval medicine. Even without scientific understanding, people could stumble onto effective techniques through observation. If a wound improved after a certain treatment, the healer remembered. And that memory eventually became a written recipe. Many of these recipes survive today in manuscripts scattered across European libraries. They are often written in Latin, though some appear in early versions of English, French, or German. One famous example comes from a 9th century medical text known as the Bald's Leech Book, written in Anglo-Saxon England. The book contains dozens of remedies for ailments ranging from headaches to infections. Some involve herbs, others include minerals or animal products. And a few recipes combine ingredients that modern researchers have found surprisingly effective against bacteria. In one case, a mixture containing garlic, onion, wine, and bile salts has been tested by modern scientists and shown to kill certain types of bacteria in laboratory conditions. The medieval author did not know about microbes, but the remedy had been preserved because it seemed to work. Still, many other treatments relied on a very different ingredient: prayer. In the medieval world, medicine and religion were rarely separated. Illness was often interpreted through spiritual language. Disease might be seen as a test of faith, a punishment for sin, or simply part of the mysterious workings of the world. So healing rituals often combined physical remedies with spiritual ones. A monk treating a fever might offer herbal tea and recite prayers over the patient. A healer might trace the sign of the cross over a wound before applying a salve. These actions were not seen as separate. They were part of the same process. Some medical manuscripts even include written charms alongside herbal recipes. These charms might invoke saints or biblical phrases believed to offer protection. Modern readers sometimes dismiss these elements as superstition. But in medieval society, they made sense. When knowledge about disease was limited, combining practical treatments with spiritual comfort felt reasonable. And sometimes the ritual itself helped calm patients, allowing them to rest and recover. But if you look closely at the medieval medicine shelf, another interesting pattern begins to appear. Many remedies focus not on curing disease, but on managing symptoms. Helping someone sleep, soothing pain, calming a cough. In other words, medieval healers often aim to make illness more bearable rather than eliminate it entirely. This practical approach explains why substances like honey, wine, and herbs appear so often. They were accessible, they were affordable, and they sometimes helped. Of course, not all ingredients were so gentle. Some jars on the shelf contained substances that modern readers might find unsettling. Powders made from animal bones, dried insects, ground minerals. In some cases, even parts of mummified bodies imported from distant lands. These ingredients were not common, but they did appear in certain medieval medical traditions. And they reveal how far people were willing to go in their search for relief. Because when illness strikes in a world without modern hospitals, people become willing to try almost anything, even remedies that sound strange today. Yet despite all these unusual ingredients, the medieval medicine cabinet still relied heavily on the same humble materials that filled ordinary kitchens. Honey, wine, bread, herbs. These were the quiet foundations of medieval healing. And sometimes, hidden within these ordinary substances, there were discoveries that would not be fully understood for hundreds of years. Which raises a quiet and curious question. If medieval healers could accidentally discover the healing properties of honey and mold, what other forgotten remedies might still be hiding in the strange medical recipes of the past? If you remain inside the medieval infirmary a little longer, watching the quiet routines unfold, you begin to notice something subtle about the way healing actually worked in the Middle Ages. It was not as rigid as modern medicine. There were no standardized hospitals, no clinical trials, no official instruction manuals enforced across entire countries. Instead, medieval medicine was shaped by countless small decisions made by individual healers. Each village herbalist, each traveling physician, each monk working inside a monastery infirmary. Together, they formed a loose network of experimentation that stretched across Europe and beyond. And that meant the medieval medicine cabinet was constantly changing. Imagine again the wooden shelves inside a monastery infirmary. You see jars of honey and bundles of herbs just as before, but now you notice something else. Small labels tied to each jar, written in careful handwriting. Some labels are old and faded. Others appear newer, as if they were added recently. That is because the contents of the shelves evolved over time. A remedy that failed repeatedly might disappear after a generation. A mixture that seemed effective would be copied into manuscripts and passed along to other healers. In a way, medieval medicine functioned like a slow-moving conversation. One healer tried something. Another heard about it. A third person wrote it down. And over the course of decades or centuries, these scattered observations began to form patterns. Sometimes those patterns led to remarkable discoveries. Take garlic, for example. Garlic was common in medieval kitchens. It flavored stews and preserved food. Farmers grew it easily, and it could survive harsh winters when other crops failed. But garlic also appeared frequently in medical recipes. Medieval texts recommended garlic for coughs, digestive problems, infections, and even parasites. It was sometimes crushed into a paste and applied to wounds, or boiled in wine to produce a strong-smelling medicinal drink. To medieval healers, garlic was considered warming, a substance that could drive harmful humors out of the body. Today, we know something they did not. Garlic contains natural antimicrobial compounds that can slow the growth of certain bacteria. While medieval physicians lacked the scientific explanation, their repeated use of garlic suggests they noticed its practical effects. The same pattern appears with vinegar. Vinegar was another everyday ingredient with surprising medical uses. Made by allowing wine to ferment into acetic acid, it had a sharp smell and a strong taste. But vinegar also worked as a mild disinfectant. Medieval healers used it to clean wounds, rinse mouths suffering from tooth pain, and sometimes wipe surfaces during outbreaks of disease. During periods of widespread illness, people even carried cloths soaked in vinegar to cover their noses, believing the sharp scent could protect them from harmful air. This idea was connected to a theory called miasma, which suggested that diseases spread through foul-smelling vapors. Although the theory was incorrect, some practices associated with it had unintended benefits. Cleaning surfaces with vinegar occasionally reduced contamination, even if the reason behind the practice was misunderstood. These kinds of accidental successes were common. But the medieval medicine cabinet was not always guided by observation alone. Sometimes tradition played an even larger role. For example, certain ingredients were believed to possess healing power simply because ancient texts said they did. The authority of classical physicians like Galen and Hippocrates carried enormous weight throughout the Middle Ages. Their writings had survived the collapse of the Western Roman Empire largely because monks preserved them in monastery libraries. Over time, these texts became the foundation of European medical education. If Galen recommended a plant for headaches, medieval doctors often accepted the claim without questioning it. Yet medieval scholars did not rely only on Greek sources. From the 8th century onward, medical knowledge from the Islamic world began flowing into Europe through translation projects in cities like Toledo. There, scholars translated Arabic scientific texts into Latin, making them accessible to European physicians. Among the most influential authors was Avicenna, whose massive encyclopedia, The Canon of Medicine, became one of the most widely studied medical books of the medieval world. Avicenna's work combined Greek philosophy with centuries of Islamic medical observation. It included detailed descriptions of herbal treatments, surgical techniques, and the preparation of complex medicines. Some of these medicines contained dozens of ingredients. One famous example was a compound known as theriac, a mixture, originally developed in ancient Rome and continuously modified throughout the Middle Ages. Theriac could contain opium, herbs, spices, and even powdered snake flesh. Apothecaries sometimes spent days preparing it, grinding and mixing ingredients in precise proportions. It was considered a universal remedy, capable of treating poisons, fevers, and various illnesses. Modern historians suspect that the opium content in theriac may have been the most effective part of the mixture. But medieval physicians saw the remedy as powerful because of its complexity. The more ingredients a medicine contained, the more impressive it seemed. This idea led to some astonishingly complicated medical recipes. A medieval physician might combine herbs from local gardens with exotic spices imported from distant lands. Ingredients from India, Persia, and North Africa sometimes appeared in European apothecary shops thanks to expanding trade networks. Spices like cinnamon, ginger, and cloves were not just used for flavor. They were believed to warm the body, stimulate digestion, and fight disease. Because these spices were expensive, their presence in medicine also carried social meaning. Wealthy patients could afford elaborate remedies containing rare imported ingredients, while poorer people relied on simpler herbal mixtures. So the medieval medicine cabinet could look very different depending on where you stood in society. In a rural village, a healer might rely on plants gathered from nearby fields and forests. In a wealthy city household, the medicine shelf might contain glass jars filled with spices brought across oceans. Yet despite these differences, the same challenge existed everywhere. No one truly understood how diseases spread. The idea that invisible microorganisms caused infection would not become widely accepted until the 19th century. Instead, medieval medicine focused heavily on balance. Doctors believed illness resulted from an imbalance in the body's humors, the four internal fluids described by ancient Greek theory. If someone developed a fever, the body was thought to contain too much heat. Cooling remedies were prescribed. If someone felt sluggish or weak, warming ingredients like spices or garlic might be recommended. This framework influenced nearly every medical decision. Even diet was considered a form of medicine. Certain foods were thought to restore balance depending on the patient's condition. Porridge for weakness, wine for circulation, herbal broths for digestive problems. Within this worldview, the medieval medicine cabinet made perfect sense. Each jar contained a tool for adjusting the body's balance. Some tools were gentle. Others were far more dramatic. Bloodletting, for example, was widely practiced across medieval Europe. Physicians believed removing small amounts of blood could rebalance the humors and cure certain illnesses. While modern medicine generally rejects the practice, bloodletting sometimes relieved pressure in cases like severe swelling or high blood pressure. But the success rate was unpredictable. Still, the procedure remained common for centuries. And this reveals something important about medieval medicine. It was not purely irrational. It was simply operating with incomplete information. Healers were trying to solve real problems, using the best explanations available to them. Sometimes those explanations were wrong. But sometimes, hidden within their experiments, they stumbled onto treatments that truly helped. The medieval medicine shelf, with all its honey jars, herbal bundles, and strange powders, was a place where observation and belief mixed together. A healer might rely on ancient texts in the morning, try a new herbal combination in the afternoon, and whisper a prayer over a patient in the evening. All three actions felt equally valid, because healing in the medieval world was never just about chemistry. It was also about hope. Yet the deeper you look into these medicine cabinets, the stranger some of the remedies become. Beyond honey and herbs, certain healers began using substances that modern readers might find deeply unsettling. Powders made from human remains, mixtures involving animal organs, even substances imported from ancient tombs. These ingredients were rare, but they existed, and their presence reveals a darker and more mysterious side of medieval medicine. A side where desperation sometimes led people to try remedies that sound almost unbelievable today. So the next question quietly waiting on the shelf is this: when medieval healers ran out of herbs and honey, what strange substances were they willing to try next? If you continue examining the shelves of a medieval medicine cabinet, you eventually notice something that feels increasingly unusual. At first, the remedies seemed almost comforting in their familiarity. honey, garlic, herbs gathered from gardens. But further along the shelves, in jars pushed slightly toward the back, you begin to find ingredients that do not resemble food at all. Some are powders made from minerals. Others come from animals. And a few, rather surprisingly, were believed to come from human bodies. This might sound unsettling from a modern perspective, but in the medieval world, the boundary between medicine, nature, and the human body was not clearly separated. Many healers believed that substances carried certain powers simply because of their origin. If a material came from something strong or resilient, it was thought that those qualities could pass into the person who consumed it. This idea was part of a broader way of thinking, sometimes called sympathetic medicine, the belief that certain substances could influence the body because of symbolic or natural connections. One example appears in the use of powdered bone. Certain medical texts describe grinding animal bones into fine dust and mixing them into drinks or salves intended to strengthen the body. The reasoning was simple. Bones represented strength and structure. So powdered bone, in theory, might help repair injuries or weakness. Other remedies involved animal organs. For instance, the liver of certain animals was sometimes recommended for people suffering from fatigue or digestive illness. Because the liver played a central role in the body, healers assumed that consuming it might restore balance in a sick person. These ideas were not entirely irrational. In fact, modern nutrition confirms that animal organs contain high levels of vitamins and minerals, but medieval healers did not know about vitamins. They simply observed that certain foods seemed to restore strength more quickly than others. And so those foods found their way into medical practice. Yet some remedies moved even further into strange territory. One of the most curious substances appearing in later medieval medicine was something known as mumia. Despite its name, mumia did not originally refer to medicine made from human remains. The word likely came from the Persian term for bitumen, a tar-like substance used in ancient embalming processes. But over time, a misunderstanding occurred. European traders traveling through the Middle East encountered preserved Egyptian mummies containing dark resins used in the embalming process. These substances resembled bitumen. And gradually, a strange idea took hold. If the preserved materials inside ancient mummies had medicinal value, perhaps the mummies themselves did too. By the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance, powdered mummy had become a bizarre but surprisingly common ingredient in some European apothecary shops. The remains of ancient Egyptian bodies were ground into powder and sold as medicine. It was believed to help with bleeding, bruises, and internal injuries. To modern readers, this practice seems deeply disturbing. But in the medieval worldview, it made a strange kind of sense. Mummies were seen as ancient, mysterious objects preserved for centuries. The belief grew that the substances involved in their preservation might contain healing properties. Of course, the trade quickly became problematic. Real Egyptian mummies were limited in number. As demand increased, counterfeit mumia appeared. Some merchants began selling powders made from ordinary human remains or even animal materials, claiming they came from ancient tombs. By the early modern period, skepticism about mumia began growing among physicians. Still, the practice persisted for centuries. It is one of the more surprising examples of how medieval medicine could drift into strange territory when observation mixed with myth. But even more unusual remedies existed. In certain folk traditions, healers recommended placing specific objects directly on wounds to draw out illness. A piece of metal might be pressed against a sore. A heated stone might be placed on aching joints. These treatments were often combined with spoken charms. Words in the medieval imagination held power. Certain phrases were believed capable of driving away disease or misfortune. A healer might recite a prayer or a short incantation while applying a remedy. These rituals might seem purely symbolic today, but in many cases, they served an important psychological role. Imagine being sick in the Middle Ages. There were no hospitals as we know them, no antibiotics, no reliable treatments for many diseases. Illness could feel frightening and unpredictable. In that environment, the presence of a healer performing a ritual mixing ingredients carefully, speaking reassuring words might bring comfort even if the remedy itself had limited medical effect. Sometimes that comfort helped the patient rest, and rest itself could support recovery. So even when medieval medicine seems strange to us, it often fulfilled emotional and social needs that were just as important as physical healing. Another curious feature of medieval medicine cabinets was their connection to trade. Some ingredients traveled remarkable distances before reaching European apothecaries. Spices from India, resins from Arabian Peninsula, herbs from North Africa. These materials moved along complex commercial routes linking Europe with Asia and the Middle East. Merchants carried them across deserts and seas, often selling them at high prices once they reached European markets. Many of these imported substances were valued as medicines long before they were used widely in cooking. Cinnamon, for instance, was believed to warm the body and improve circulation. Ginger was thought to aid digestion. Cloves were sometimes recommended for tooth pain. In fact, cloves contain natural compounds that can numb tissue slightly, which may explain why they became a traditional remedy for dental discomfort. Again, medieval healers lacked modern chemical explanations, but their repeated observation sometimes guided them toward useful treatments. Still, it is important to remember that medieval medicine remained highly uncertain. Even experienced physicians often struggled to determine which treatments truly helped and which did not. Epidemics, in particular, exposed the limits of medieval knowledge. When diseases spread rapidly through towns and villages, healers could offer little more than supportive care. Herbal drinks, cooling cloths, prayers. Some patients recovered, others did not. The reasons were rarely clear. Yet despite these limitations, medieval medicine slowly accumulated knowledge that would influence future generations. The habit of writing down recipes, the practice of carefully preparing medicines, the idea that observation could improve treatment. All of these traditions helped lay the groundwork for the development of modern pharmacy. And at the center of many of those early experiments were the humble ingredients we first noticed on the medicine shelf. Honey, herbs, wine, even moldy bread. Each represented an attempt to understand the natural world just a little better. Over centuries, those attempts gradually evolved into something more systematic. But during the Middle Ages, the medicine cabinet remained a mixture of careful observation, inherited tradition, and hopeful experimentation. A place where practical knowledge and strange ideas lived side by side. And while some remedies may seem unusual today, they remind us of a simple truth about human history. When people face illness and uncertainty, they search for answers wherever they can find them. Even in honey jars, even in herbs gathered from quiet gardens, and sometimes in the most unexpected places imaginable. Yet the medieval world contained another substance that quietly shaped daily life, one that people consumed not just as medicine, but as an everyday drink. A substance so common that many people relied on it from morning until night. And strangely enough, it was often safer to drink than water. So the next question waiting in our slow journey through medieval life is this: Why did so many people in the Middle Ages drink alcohol every day? And how did it quietly become one of the most important medicines in medieval society? Story 3. When beer was safer than water, everyday intoxication in medieval cities. If you were to spend a day in a medieval European city, perhaps sometime around the year 1300, you might notice something curious almost immediately. Nearly everyone is drinking alcohol. Not in the loud, celebratory way people imagine when they think of feasts or taverns. Instead, drinking happens quietly and constantly, woven into the normal rhythm of everyday life. A craftsman begins his morning with a mug. A child is handed a small cup at lunch. Laborers pause during work to take slow, steady sips from wooden mugs. Even monks and nuns drink it with their meals. The drink is not particularly strong, and no one seems especially intoxicated, but it is everywhere. The reason is simple. In much of medieval Europe, alcohol was often safer to drink than water. This might sound strange at first, but it becomes easier to understand once you imagine what medieval cities were actually like. Take a walk through a typical European town of the period. Narrow streets wind between timber buildings. Animals move freely through the marketplace. Waste from homes and workshops sometimes ends up in nearby gutters or streams. The concept of sanitation as we understand it today did not yet exist. Water sources inside cities were frequently contaminated. Wells could become polluted by nearby waste pits. Rivers flowing through towns often carried refuse from upstream settlements. Even rainwater stored in barrels could grow unsafe if left too long. People did not know about bacteria or microorganisms. The idea of invisible germs causing disease would not emerge until centuries later. But medieval communities were very good at noticing patterns. And one pattern became clear over time. Water sometimes made people sick. Beer and wine usually did not. The explanation, although unknown to them, lies in the brewing and fermentation processes. Alcoholic drinks require boiling, fermentation, or both steps that reduce harmful microorganisms. As a result, beverages like beer often contained fewer disease-causing microbes than untreated water. So people drank them frequently. In northern parts of Europe, beer was the most common daily drink. Brewing had been practiced for thousands of years before the Middle Ages. Ancient civilizations from Mesopotamia to ancient Egypt had already developed methods for fermenting grains into beer. By medieval times, the process was widely understood across Europe. The basic ingredients were simple. Grain, usually barley or wheat. Water, yeast, and sometimes herbs for flavor. The grain was first soaked and allowed to germinate, producing malt. The malt was then dried and ground before being mixed with water and heated. Yeast, either intentionally added or naturally present in the environment, would ferment the mixture. The result was beer. But medieval beer was quite different from what many people drink today. Most everyday beer was weak, often containing only a small amount of alcohol. Historians sometimes refer to this drink as small beer. Small beer could be consumed throughout the day without causing heavy intoxication. It was nourishing, mildly energizing, and relatively safe. Even children drank it. This might sound surprising, but the alcohol content was usually very low. In many cases, small beer contained no more alcohol than certain modern fermented drinks like kombucha. And because the brewing process involved boiling the water used in the mixture, the final drink was often safer than untreated water. Brewing quickly became a central activity in medieval households. In fact, for much of the Middle Ages, beer production was largely domestic. Families brewed their own batches in kitchens or small outbuildings. The task often fell to women. Female brewers were common throughout medieval Europe, and in England they were sometimes known as alewives. These women brewed beer for their families and occasionally sold extra batches to neighbors. Their work was so widespread that it became a recognized part of the medieval economy. In some towns, local authorities even created regulations to control the price and quality of beer. One famous example comes from England, where laws known as the assize of bread and ale were introduced during the reign of Henry III in the 13th century. These regulations attempted to ensure that bread and ale remained affordable and that brewers did not dilute their products excessively. Inspectors sometimes visited brewing households to taste the beer and check whether it met acceptable standards. The process sounds almost amusing today, officials walking through neighborhoods sampling mugs of ale, but it reflected how important beer had become in everyday life. Without reliable access to safe drinking water, communities depended on fermented beverages. And beer was not just a drink. It was food. Medieval diets could be surprisingly limited, especially for poorer households. Bread formed the foundation of most meals, often accompanied by vegetables or simple soups. Beer added calories and nutrients. Because it was made from grains, small beer contained carbohydrates and small amounts of vitamins produced during fermentation. For laborers working long hours in fields or workshops, it provided energy. So drinking beer was not considered indulgent. It was practical. But the relationship between alcohol and daily life did not stop there. Beer also played an important role inside monasteries. Although monastic life emphasized discipline and moderation, monks were not forbidden from drinking beer or wine. In fact, many monasteries brewed their own supplies. In places like Weihenstephan Abbey in Freising, brewing traditions date back nearly 1,000 years. Monks brewed beer for their own consumption, for visiting travelers, and sometimes for sale to nearby communities. The brewing process fit naturally into the rhythm of monastic life. Grain could be grown on monastery lands. Brewing required patience and careful attention, qualities monks were already trained to practice through daily routines of prayer and work. And during periods of fasting, beer could even provide a modest source of nourishment. Some monks jokingly referred to strong beer as liquid bread. Of course, not all alcohol in medieval Europe came from beer. In southern regions where grapes grew easily, wine dominated daily life. In places like France, Italy, and parts of Spain, vineyards covered hillsides and valleys. Wine was consumed with meals, diluted with water, and used in various cooking and medical preparations. Like beer, wine had practical advantages. Its acidity and alcohol content helped preserve it and reduce microbial contamination. For this reason, even modest households often preferred wine to untreated water when possible. But alcohol in medieval society served another quiet purpose as well. It acted as a kind of medicine. Physicians frequently recommended wine as a base for herbal remedies. Medicinal plants could be steeped in wine to create tinctures, making them easier to swallow and preserve. Wine was also used to calm nerves, stimulate appetite, and dull mild pain. And when stronger sedatives like poppy preparations were unavailable, alcohol sometimes filled the gap. A cup of strong ale or wine could help a sick person relax and sleep. This connection between alcohol and medicine explains why it appeared so often in medieval medical texts. A remedy might instruct the healer to grind herbs into powder and mix them with wine before giving the mixture to the patient. The alcohol helped extract the plant's compounds and carry them into the body. So once again, the medieval medicine cabinet overlapped with everyday life. The same drink people consumed at dinner might also serve as the base for a healing potion. Yet despite all these practical uses, medieval society was not entirely comfortable with alcohol's effects. Religious authorities occasionally warned against excessive drinking. Monastic rules emphasized moderation. And moralists sometimes complained about taverns, where stronger ales led to noisy gatherings late into the night. Even in a culture where alcohol was normal, people recognized that too much could cause problems. Still, for the majority of medieval people, beer and wine remained essential parts of daily survival. They were nourishment. They were medicine. And perhaps most importantly, they were reliable. In a world where water could not always be trusted, fermented drinks offered a simple form of protection, even if no one fully understood why. Yet as medieval cities grew larger and trade networks expanded, alcohol itself began to change. Brewers experimented with new ingredients. Stronger drinks began appearing, and taverns slowly transformed into social spaces where drinking meant something more than simple hydration. Which leads to an interesting question. If beer started as a practical solution to unsafe water, how did medieval taverns gradually become places of entertainment, storytelling, and sometimes trouble? If you stay in the medieval city a little longer, perhaps wandering through its narrow streets as evening approaches, you will begin to notice another important place where beer and wine shape daily life. The tavern. At first glance, a medieval tavern might appear simple. A wooden sign hangs outside the door, often painted with an animal, a crown, or a cluster of grapes, so that even those who cannot read can recognize the establishment. Inside, the room is warm and dimly lit. Wooden benches line the walls. A long table stretches across the center of the space. Somewhere near the back, a large barrel sits on a raised platform with a tap hammered into its side. This is where the drinks come from. The tavern keeper fills mugs directly from the barrel, handing them across the counter to customers who arrive after long days of work. The drink is usually ale, a form of beer brewed without hops, which were not widely used in Northern Europe until later in the Middle Ages. The taste is mild, slightly sour and refreshing. And like the small beer people drink throughout the day, it is rarely strong enough to cause immediate drunkenness. But taverns are not just places to drink. They are places to talk. In a medieval city, there are few spaces where people from different walks of life regularly gather. Markets bring traders together. Churches bring communities together for worship, but taverns offer something else entirely. Conversation. Here, laborers sit beside merchants. Travelers share tables with craftsmen. News spreads quickly through these rooms, stories from distant towns, rumors of wars, changes in taxes, or the arrival of new trade goods. In a world without newspapers or radios, taverns function as informal information networks. And because drinking is already part of daily life, the gathering feels natural. But the story of medieval drinking does not belong only to tavern keepers and customers. It also belongs to the brewers. As we mentioned earlier, much of the beer in medieval Europe was brewed at home. This meant that thousands of households quietly participated in small-scale brewing. And very often, the people responsible for that brewing were women. Across England and parts of Northern Europe, female brewers were known as alewives. Alewives brewed beer in their kitchens using simple equipment: large pots for boiling grain, wooden tubs for fermentation, and barrels for storage. If a batch turned out well, they might sell extra mugs to neighbors or passers-by. This was not considered unusual. In fact, brewing was one of the most common ways women contributed to household income during the Middle Ages. Some alewives became quite successful. In busy towns, a skilled brewer could build a regular customer base, selling ale from a window or small doorway in the home. Over time, certain houses became known for particularly good beer. Local authorities even developed systems to regulate these informal businesses. In parts of England, officials known as ale tasters were appointed to monitor brewing quality. These inspectors visited households where beer was sold, sampling the ale and ensuring it met basic standards. They also enforced price regulations established under laws like the assize of bread and ale, which we mentioned earlier during the reign of Henry III. These laws tried to keep food and drink affordable while preventing dishonest brewing practices. It might sound like an early form of food safety regulation, and in some ways it was. Yet brewing remained a personal craft. Every batch of ale was slightly different. The flavor depended on the grain, the yeast in the air, and the skill of the brewer. Temperature mattered. So did cleanliness. If the brewing vessels were not washed properly, the next batch could develop strange flavors or spoil entirely. This unpredictability meant that brewing required experience. Alewives learned through observation and repetition, adjusting their methods slowly over years. Some medieval illustrations even show female brewers wearing tall hats while selling their ale, possibly to make themselves visible in crowded marketplaces. Interestingly, centuries later, these images may have contributed to the visual stereotype of witches wearing pointed hats. But in the Middle Ages, these women were not feared. They were respected members of their communities. Their beer nourished families, fueled workers, and filled taverns with conversation. And for the most part, the alcohol content remained relatively mild. That began to change gradually during the later Middle Ages. One important shift involved a plant called hops. Hops are flowers that add bitterness and aroma to beer while also helping preserve it. Although hops were known earlier in some parts of Europe, they became widely used in brewing during the late medieval period, particularly in regions of Germany and Netherlands. Brewers discovered that hopped beer stayed fresh longer than traditional ale. This allowed it to be transported over greater distances, making it easier to sell in larger markets. The change slowly transformed the brewing industry. Instead of thousands of small household brewers, larger commercial breweries began appearing in major cities. Professional brewers produced beer in bigger batches, distributing it across wider areas. This shift gradually reduced the role of alewives, particularly in urban centers. Brewing became more industrial, more regulated, and increasingly dominated by male guild members. But during the earlier medieval centuries, the world of brewing still belonged largely to ordinary households. And those households continued producing the drinks that sustained daily life. Still, even weak beer could occasionally lead to overindulgence. Medieval writers sometimes complained about drunkenness, especially in busy towns where taverns stayed open late into the night. One famous literary example appears in the work of Geoffrey Chaucer, whose Canterbury Tales includes characters who drink freely while sharing stories on their journey. Chaucer's descriptions are humorous, but they reflect a real cultural phenomenon. Taverns were places where social boundaries softened. A merchant might boast loudly about his travels. A traveler might exaggerate stories of distant lands. A group of craftsmen might celebrate the completion of a difficult project with extra mugs of ale. Most of the time, these gatherings remained peaceful. But occasionally, alcohol fueled arguments or fights. City records from the medieval period contain numerous complaints about disturbances in taverns. Some towns even passed curfew laws limiting how late drinking establishments could remain open. Still, these regulations rarely eliminated tavern culture entirely. People continued gathering there because the tavern offered something rare in medieval life: relaxation. After long days of physical labor, a warm room, a wooden bench, and a mug of ale could feel deeply comforting. The drink itself was not always the main attraction. The conversation was. The laughter, the shared stories. In a world where many people lived hard and uncertain lives, these small moments of companionship mattered, and alcohol quietly supported them. But even as beer and wine dominated daily life, something new was beginning to appear on the edges of medieval society. A stronger kind of drink. Unlike beer, this new substance was not brewed through fermentation alone. It was distilled, and its effects were far more powerful than the gentle drinks most medieval people were used to. At first, it was not consumed for pleasure. It was considered medicine. Scholars and alchemists believed it possessed special properties, something almost magical. They even gave it a remarkable name. Aqua vitae, the water of life, which raises a quiet question for our slow journey through medieval substances. When people first discovered distilled alcohol, why did they believe it could cure illness? And how did this mysterious water of life eventually become one of the most powerful drinks in human history? As evening settles over the medieval city, the taverns slowly grow quieter. A few customers finish their mugs of ale, while others step out into narrow streets illuminated only by torchlight and the occasional lantern. Inside the tavern, the remaining drinkers are not consuming anything particularly strong. The beer is mild. The wine, though richer, is still diluted more often than not. But somewhere else in the medieval world, far from the noise of the tavern, a different kind of drink is being created. And it is far stronger than anything most people have tasted before. To find its origins, you have to leave the tavern and enter the world of scholars and experimenters, people who spent long hours studying substances, heating liquids, and trying to understand the hidden properties of nature. In other words, you have to step into the strange early world of alchemy. Alchemy during the Middle Ages was not simply about turning lead into gold. It was a wide field of investigation combining philosophy, early chemistry, medicine, and spiritual belief. Alchemists believed that nature contained hidden transformation waiting to be discovered. Metals could change. Liquids could be purified. And perhaps with enough knowledge, the secrets of life itself could be revealed. Much of this experimentation took place in the Islamic world, where scholars had preserved and expanded ancient Greek scientific traditions. One particularly influential figure was Jabir ibn Hayyan, whose writings described laboratory equipment and chemical processes that later influenced European thinkers. Among the tools described in these works was something called an alembic. The alembic was a simple but powerful invention. It allowed a liquid to be heated until it produced vapor. That vapor could then travel through a tube into a cooler container, where it condensed back into liquid form. In other words, the alembic made distillation possible. Distillation separates substances based on how easily they evaporate. If wine is heated in a distillation apparatus, the alcohol within it vaporizes before the water does. When that vapor cools and condenses, the resulting liquid contains a higher concentration of alcohol. This new liquid is much stronger than the original wine. Early alchemists discovered this property gradually, through careful experimentation. At first, distilled liquids were not intended for drinking. They were considered medicinal extracts. Alchemists believed that distillation captured the essence of a substance, its most refined and powerful qualities. When applied to wine, the result seemed remarkable. The distilled liquid burned when touched by flame. It evaporated quickly, and when consumed, even in small amounts, it produced a warming sensation throughout the body. Because of these unusual qualities, early scholars gave the substance a poetic name. Aqua vitae, the water of life. One of the first European scholars known to describe this distilled alcohol was Arnold of Villanova, who lived during the late 13th and early 14th centuries. Arnold studied medicine in places like Montpellier, one of the major centers of medieval medical education. There, physicians were deeply interested in combining classical medical knowledge with newer discoveries arriving from the Islamic world. Distilled alcohol fascinated them. In small doses, it seemed to warm the body and stimulate circulation. Physicians experimented with mixing herbs into distilled spirits to create powerful medicinal tinctures. Some even believed aquavitae could extend life itself. Medical texts began describing it as a remedy for fatigue, digestive problems, and certain infections. But these early doctors also recognized its dangers. Distilled alcohol was far stronger than beer or wine. A person who drank too much could quickly become disoriented or unconscious. For this reason, aquavitae remained primarily a medicine during its early years in Europe. It was administered in small amounts, often diluted or combined with herbs. Monasteries once again played an important role in preserving and refining these techniques. Just as monks had carefully cultivated medicinal plants, some monastic communities began experimenting with distillation. In quiet monastery workshops, copper stills heated mixtures of wine and herbs, producing fragrant distilled liquids used for medicinal purposes. Over time, certain monasteries became famous for their herbal distillations. Even today, some historic European liqueurs trace their origins back to these early experiments. But outside monastery walls, the potential of distilled alcohol slowly began to attract attention. Merchants realized that distilled spirits could be transported easily and stored for long periods without spoiling. Unlike beer, which might sour after weeks, distilled alcohol could remain stable for months or even years. This made it valuable. And wherever something valuable appears in a growing trade network, people eventually find ways to produce more of it. By the late Middle Ages, distillation techniques had begun spreading beyond scholarly circles. Craftsmen, apothecaries, and tavern keepers experimented with small stills of their own. They discovered that distilled alcohol could be produced not only from wine, but also from fermented grain mashes, similar to those used in brewing beer. The results were powerful drinks, unlike anything most medieval people had experienced. Early forms of brandy appeared in wine-producing regions. Primitive grain spirits emerged in northern Europe. These drinks were not yet the refined liquors people know today. They were often harsh, smoky, and unpredictable in strength. But their effects were undeniable. Even small cups could produce warmth, relaxation, and sometimes overwhelming intoxication. This new category of drink slowly transformed the landscape of alcohol consumption. Beer and wine remained daily beverages. Distilled spirits became something else. They were stronger, rarer, and for many people, slightly mysterious. Some still considered them medicine. Others treated them as luxury items. And gradually, they began appearing in taverns alongside the familiar mugs of ale. For the first time in European history, ordinary people could encounter alcohol in concentrations far beyond what earlier generations had experienced. This change would eventually reshape drinking culture across the continent. But during the medieval period itself, distilled spirits remained relatively uncommon. Most people continued relying on the drinks they knew best: beer, wine, and the countless small variations brewed in kitchens, monasteries, and taverns across Europe. These beverages had quietly sustained medieval life for centuries. They nourished workers, comforted the sick, and provided safe hydration in a world where clean water was not always available. Yet alcohol was only one of the many strange substances medieval people used in their search for relief, healing, or altered states of mind. Beyond Europe, other cultures had discovered entirely different plants with powerful effects. Some were calming, some were intoxicating, and some were controversial enough to spark debates among religious scholars and rulers. One of those substances, in particular, would spread across parts of the medieval world with surprising speed. It came from a humble green plant, a plant that today is known across the globe. But during the Middle Ages, it was already stirring arguments about medicine, morality, and the limits of human pleasure. So the next quiet question waiting in our journey is this: how did a simple plant called cannabis become both a medicine and a source of controversy in the medieval Islamic world? Story 4. Cannabis in the medieval Islamic world. If you leave the medieval taverns of Europe and travel eastward across the Mediterranean Sea, through the markets of the Middle East, and into the great cities of the Islamic world, you begin to encounter a very different cultural landscape. The streets are busy with merchants selling spices, textiles, and books. Scholars gather in courtyards discussing philosophy and mathematics. Physicians carefully copy medical texts that preserve knowledge from Greek, Persian, and Indian traditions. This world is deeply connected through trade and scholarship. And within it, a particular plant has quietly become part of daily life in ways that surprise many modern readers. The plant is cannabis. Today, cannabis is often discussed in terms of modern debates about legality or recreational use. But centuries before those discussions existed, the plant already had a long and complicated history in parts of the medieval world. To understand how it arrived there, you must go much further back in time. Cannabis had been cultivated in Central and South Asia for thousands of years. Ancient societies in places like India and China used the plant for multiple purposes. Its fibers were strong and useful for making rope and textiles. Its seeds were nutritious and could be pressed for oil. And its resin, the sticky substance produced by certain varieties of the plant, had noticeable effects when consumed. By the early medieval period, cannabis had spread widely across parts of Asia and the Middle East through trade routes connecting these regions. These routes, sometimes grouped under the broad name Silk Road, carried not only goods but also ideas, plants, and medical knowledge. Merchants transported spices, fabrics, medicines, and seeds from one region to another. Over centuries, these exchanges allowed cannabis to reach new societies where it took on new roles. Within the medieval Islamic world, cannabis appeared in several forms. One of the most common was hashish, a concentrated product made by collecting and compressing the resin of the cannabis plant. Hashish could be eaten, mixed into food, or sometimes dissolved into drinks. Its effects varied depending on the strength and quantity consumed. In small amounts, people reported relaxation and mild euphoria. Larger doses could produce drowsiness, altered perception, or intense introspection. Because of these effects, hashish became associated with both medicine and recreation. And that dual role soon sparked debates among scholars. Islamic law, derived from religious teachings and legal traditions, clearly prohibited the consumption of alcohol. Wine and other intoxicating drinks were forbidden because they clouded the mind and interfered with moral judgment. But cannabis presented a more complicated question. Unlike wine, it was not fermented. And unlike alcohol, its effects did not always resemble drunkenness. Some people consumed it in small amounts as a medicinal substance. Others used it recreationally, seeking relaxation or pleasure. This created a legal and moral puzzle. Was cannabis an intoxicant in the same sense as wine? Or was it something different? Medieval scholars disagreed. Some religious authorities argued that anything altering the mind should be avoided. Others believed cannabis could be acceptable in limited circumstances, especially if used for medical purposes. The debates appear in writings from scholars across the Islamic world, including those living in cities like Baghdad, Cairo, and Damascus. These cities were centers of learning during the medieval period, home to libraries, universities, and hospitals where physicians studied both ancient and contemporary medical knowledge. Among the most influential medical thinkers was Avicenna, whose famous encyclopedia, The Canon of Medicine, described numerous plants and treatments used throughout the Islamic world. Avicenna mentioned cannabis in his writings, noting its potential medicinal effects, but also warning about excessive use. In small quantities, cannabis could relieve certain types of pain. In larger amounts, it could disturb the mind. This cautious attitude was typical of medieval physicians. Like many substances we have discussed, poppy, alcohol, and others, cannabis existed in a gray area between medicine and indulgence. The key question was dosage. And as with many medieval medicines, dosage was difficult to control. Hashish could vary greatly in strength depending on how it was prepared. The resin content of cannabis plants changes based on climate, soil conditions, and cultivation methods. So 2 pieces of hashish might look similar while producing very different effects. This unpredictability made physicians cautious. But it did not stop the substance from spreading. By the 13th century, references to hashish appear in stories, poetry, and travel accounts throughout parts of the Middle East. Some descriptions portray it humorously. Others warn about its misuse. One famous medieval traveler who documented aspects of the Islamic world was Ibn Battuta. Although his writings focus primarily on geography and culture rather than drugs, they offer glimpses of the social environments where substances like hashish were known. In certain urban neighborhoods, particularly among laborers and craftsmen, small gatherings sometimes formed around the consumption of hashish. People would sit together, share food, and consume small portions of the resin. The atmosphere was often quiet and reflective rather than rowdy. This difference partly explains why cannabis attracted less immediate condemnation than alcohol. Alcohol frequently led to loud intoxication and public disorder. Hashish often produced slower, more inward experiences. Still, not everyone approved. Some rulers and religious leaders viewed hashish as a threat to social discipline. Throughout the medieval period, occasional attempts were made to suppress its use. For example, certain authorities in Egypt issued bans on cannabis consumption during the 13th and 14th centuries. Officials sometimes ordered cannabis plants destroyed or punished sellers who distributed hashish. Yet these efforts rarely eliminated the substance entirely. Like many plants that grow easily and travel well, cannabis proved difficult to control. It could be cultivated quietly in gardens or remote fields. Its seeds were small and easily transported, and its use was already woven into certain cultural traditions. So despite periodic crackdowns, hashish remained present in parts of medieval society. Its role continued shifting between medicine, recreation, and controversy. Meanwhile, physicians continued studying its properties. They experimented with cannabis in ointments, tinctures, and herbal mixtures designed to calm pain or improve sleep. In this sense, cannabis joined the long list of plants medieval doctors tried while searching for ways to ease human suffering. Some of those plants were powerful, others were harmless, and many remained poorly understood. But they all shared a common story. They were part of humanity's long attempt to explore the natural world to discover which plants could heal, which could harm, and which might simply offer a brief moment of relief from life's difficulties. Yet cannabis was only one example. The medieval Islamic world contained many other fascinating experiments with medicinal plants and substances. Physicians there developed hospitals, wrote encyclopedias of medicine, and studied treatments with remarkable care. In fact, some of the most advanced medical knowledge of the medieval period came from scholars working in these regions. Which raises another quiet question as we continue this slow journey through history. How did medieval Islamic physicians build some of the world's earliest hospitals, and what surprising medicines did they use inside them? If you follow the medieval Islamic world into its cities, you begin to notice more than markets, scholars, and coffee-colored alleys. You begin to see institutions that were extraordinary for their time, hospitals. Unlike the small infirmaries you might have seen in medieval Europe, these hospitals, often called bimaristans, were sophisticated centers of medical care, education, and research. Cities such as Baghdad, Cairo, and Damascus hosted bimaristans that could accommodate hundreds of patients, with wards separated by illness, lecture halls for students, and attached pharmacies where hundreds of substances were prepared. Imagine stepping into one of these hospitals. The air carries a mixture of fragrances, herbs steeping in water, vinegar used to clean floors, incense burned to provide a calming atmosphere. Monks, physicians, and apothecaries move through the halls, carefully preparing treatments for the patients. Cannabis was one of the many plants used within these hospitals. Physicians experimented with it in controlled ways, using small doses to treat pain, insomnia, and digestive problems. Sometimes it was mixed into syrups, sometimes ground into ointments, and sometimes combined with other herbs to enhance its effects. The preparation of these medicines was meticulous. Apothecaries maintained lists of ingredients, measured precise quantities, and stored their materials in labeled jars. Each herb had specific properties, dosage recommendations, and sometimes warnings about potential side effects. Cannabis shared these instructions with other substances: opium, myrrh, saffron, and hundreds of lesser-known herbs. Physicians were aware that the same plant could have different effects depending on how it was processed. They noted that freshness mattered, that boiling or roasting could change the potency, and that combinations with other herbs could either amplify or reduce its effects. This careful approach demonstrates something crucial about medieval Islamic medicine. Despite modern stereotypes of the mystical alchemist, these physicians were remarkably empirical in their observations. They recorded what worked and what did not, sometimes noting failures as clearly as successes. Over time, these observations were compiled into encyclopedias, systematic, detailed, and surprisingly practical guides to the natural world. Hospitals also had a social function. They were open to the public, often free or heavily subsidized, and included separate wards for men, women, and children. Patients received care for a variety of illnesses: fevers, injuries, digestive disorders, and chronic pain. In some cases, physicians used cannabis not just for treatment, but also for comfort, helping patients endure symptoms that medicine could not fully cure. The knowledge generated in these hospitals slowly traveled along trade and scholarly networks. Manuscripts were copied in workshops, sent to distant cities, and translated into multiple languages. Through these exchanges, knowledge of medicinal cannabis spread beyond its original regions. Yet, as in Europe, controversy sometimes followed the use of psychoactive substances. While cannabis could be used safely in measured doses, recreational overuse worried scholars and religious authorities. They debated its morality, legality, and social consequences. Some rulers issued bans or penalties for public use. Others allowed limited consumption in controlled medicinal contexts. By observing these debates and hospital practices, we can see a clear pattern. Medieval Islamic societies were experimenting with complex substances while maintaining a careful balance between public safety, moral expectations, and medical knowledge. Cannabis existed in that tension, a plant valued for its medicinal properties, yet capable of producing effects that demanded caution. But the story of cannabis in the medieval Islamic world is only one chapter in the broader story of human experimentation with plants and medicine. While these hospitals were experimenting with controlled doses, European travelers, merchants, and soldiers were slowly learning about these substances through contact, trade, and cultural exchange. Over centuries, cannabis would begin to appear in Europe as well, first as a medicine, then as a controversial substance, much like it had in the cities of the Middle East. The curiosity of medieval physicians, their careful observation, record-keeping, and experimentation, is what allowed certain plants, including cannabis, to survive and retain a place in medicinal traditions for centuries. It also shows how human societies have always sought ways to harness the natural world for both survival and comfort, even when the effects were unpredictable or socially complex. Yet a quiet question remains. In these hospitals, cannabis was just one of many powerful substances. How did physicians decide which substances to trust, which to combine, and which might do more harm than good? And what was the broader impact of these medical experiments on the development of European medicine centuries later? As the sun sets over the bustling streets of a medieval Middle Eastern city, the Bimera stands slowly quiet. Patients rest in their wards, apothecaries finish labeling jars, and physicians record the day's observations in manuscripts that will survive centuries. Among the hundreds of plants and substances studied, cannabis quietly holds its place both as a medicine and as a symbol of humanity's ongoing experimentation with the natural world. By this point in history, cannabis had already achieved something remarkable. It had traveled across empires, been adapted for medical use, and survived the scrutiny of religious and social authorities. Its medicinal applications had been codified, debated, and refined. Physicians recorded dosages, preparation methods, and potential side effects, creating a body of knowledge that would influence generations of practitioners. But the story of cannabis was not confined to the Islamic world. Trade and travel carried the plant into new regions, including North Africa, the Mediterranean, and eventually Europe. As merchants and travelers moved across the Silk Road and along the Mediterranean trade networks, they brought seeds, resins, and knowledge about the plant's effects. European physicians, often translating Arabic medical texts into Latin, encountered detailed descriptions of cannabis, sometimes alongside opium, myrrh, and other substances. This exchange of knowledge had a profound effect. Medieval Europe, which had previously relied primarily on herbs native to its forests and fields, suddenly gained access to a wider array of medicinal plants. Cannabis entered European pharmacopoeias, appearing in recipes for salves, tinctures, and powders. Physicians recognized its value for pain relief, sleep disorders, and digestive issues, though they often emphasized caution, reflecting debates already present in the Islamic world. Meanwhile, in the Islamic world, cannabis continued to occupy multiple roles. It was medicine, recreational substance, and sometimes a subject of legal and moral controversy. Scholars and rulers debated how much control was appropriate, weighing the plant's benefits against potential social disruptions. These debates reveal something important about medieval approaches to substances. Societies were not simply permissive or restrictive. They carefully observed, experimented, and adapted social norms around use. Cannabis also contributed to cultural and artistic life. References to hashish appear in poetry, storytelling, and folklore, often highlighting its mind-altering effects or its role in social gatherings. These cultural dimensions reinforced the plant's presence in everyday life and ensured that it would remain significant long after any single generation had passed. By the late medieval period, cannabis had established a robust and complex role across multiple societies. It demonstrated the capacity of humans to experiment with the natural world, to observe outcomes, and to transmit that knowledge across borders and generations. It was neither wholly medicine nor purely a recreational substance. It existed in a nuanced space shaped by social, moral, and medical considerations. Yet for all its established roles, cannabis remained mysterious. Its potency varied. Its effects could be subtle or profound. Its social and moral implications were debated wherever it appeared. In that sense, it is emblematic of the broader story of medieval medicine, a careful balance between empirical observation, inherited knowledge, and the limits of human understanding. In reflecting on the medieval journey of cannabis, several lessons emerge. First, human societies have always sought solutions to pain, illness, and discomfort, often experimenting with substances whose effects are not fully understood. Second, knowledge is cumulative. The careful observations of Islamic physicians traveled to Europe, influencing medical practices far beyond their original context. Third, substances like cannabis highlight the interplay between medicine, culture, and morality, an interplay that continues to shape debates about natural and psychoactive substances today. As we close this chapter, the plant quietly waits in the background of history, a reminder of humanity's enduring curiosity, adaptability, and willingness to experiment with the natural world in pursuit of health, comfort, and understanding. Yet even as cannabis spread and influenced medical practice, other plants, fungi, and substances were quietly shaping lives in parallel substances that would later appear in Europe, Asia, and beyond. One of the most intriguing of these is a fungus that thrived on bread, grain, and hidden corners of medieval storage rooms: mold. Mold, which today seems harmless in small amounts, was at the center of some of the earliest accidental experiments with what would become modern antibiotics. So the next question to consider in our slow journey through medieval substances is this: how did medieval people encounter mold, and what early insights did they gain from it, long before anyone understood microbes or modern medicine? Story 5. Moldy bread and the accidental discovery of antibiotics. If you step into a medieval kitchen or storage room, you will notice that it is not always as tidy as a modern home. Grain sacks sit in corners, loaves of bread are stacked on shelves, and containers of dried herbs and seeds rest near the walls. In this environment, a quiet and uninvited guest often appears: mold. Mold in its various forms thrives wherever moisture and warmth are present. On bread, it appears as green, white, or blue patches, fuzzy in texture and unmistakable in smell. On stored grains, it forms thin films that glimmer under the light of a lantern. Medieval people would have noticed mold frequently, often with distaste or concern. Yet despite their occasional disgust, some people observed that mold might have practical uses, sometimes accidentally discovering that substances growing in hidden corners of food could influence health. For instance, medieval texts occasionally mention mold in the context of rotting substances with medical properties, although the authors did not understand microbes, bacteria, or fungi in the modern sense. Bread was particularly interesting. In most households, bread was a staple food, consumed multiple times daily. Without refrigeration or preservatives, loaves could easily develop mold if left too long. For the poor, who could not afford to waste food, even moldy bread was sometimes eaten, especially after scraping off the thickest patches. This could occasionally lead to illness, but other times, people reported relief from minor infections or digestive upset, likely due to compounds produced by certain molds, although they did not understand why. In some parts of Europe and Asia, herbalists or folk healers began using moldy substances intentionally in small ways. Moldy bread or grains might be applied to wounds or sores, particularly in regions where access to more refined remedies was limited. Occasionally, these applications seemed to help. Some wounds that would have festered began to dry out. Infections subsided in ways that appeared remarkable given the limited medical knowledge of the time. These observations were entirely empirical. There was no understanding of microbes or antibiotics. There was no knowledge of penicillin, which would only be isolated centuries later by Alexander Fleming. Yet, in the slow and careful experimentation of medieval households and folk medicine, hints of what would eventually become modern antimicrobial treatment quietly existed. Monasteries, too, played a subtle role in this process. Monks often cared for the sick, using what was available in the surrounding environment. Bread, herbs, wine, and even moldy substances could all become part of a healing regimen. Records from monastic infirmaries sometimes describe the application of poultices made from damp bread, often combined with honey or herbs, to treat wounds. While the understanding of why this worked was absent, the observation that certain applications improved outcomes persisted. Even travelers' accounts occasionally hint at these practices. Merchants moving through towns and villages sometimes noted that local healers used unconventional methods for treating wounds, sores, or infections. Moldy bread, when combined with other ingredients, appeared occasionally as a remedy, a small, seemingly insignificant observation that centuries later would resonate in the history of medicine. Bread and grain molds were not always beneficial. Some were clearly harmful, causing sickness or digestive upset. But in other cases, compounds produced by the fungi invisible to the eye had antimicrobial properties. Over time, repeated observation and experimentation in different contexts laid the groundwork for recognizing patterns, that certain moldy substances could prevent infection, even if no one could articulate why. The key lesson here is subtle. Human history is full of accidental discoveries, and many relied on simple observation, noticing that a particular substance sometimes healed wounds or prevented illness, and recording that fact for future use. In the absence of microscopes, chemical analysis, or laboratories, empirical knowledge accumulated slowly, often in ways that were almost invisible. Yet mold remained a mysterious and ambiguous presence. Some healers feared it. Some relied on it cautiously. Most people avoided it when possible, eating only the freshest bread and grains. But the few who experimented, whether intentionally or accidentally, contributed to a long chain of observation that centuries later would revolutionize medicine. By the end of the medieval period, mold was still largely a nuisance in kitchens, a sign of spoiled food, and an occasional folk remedy. But in these hidden corners of daily life, humanity's earliest insights into the potential of microorganisms were quietly taking shape. The question that lingers, as we peer into this shadowy world of bread, spores, and early medicine, is this: how did these accidental insights eventually connect to the formal development of medical microbiology in later centuries, and what other, hidden, substances in medieval life might have had surprising medicinal potential? If you imagine yourself in a medieval village, the role of a healer often fell to individuals who combined household knowledge, observation, and experimentation, sometimes with curious results. In this context, moldy bread, previously considered a nuisance or a sign of spoiled food, began to acquire a strange reputation as a potential remedy. Wounds, both minor and severe, were common. Farmers cut themselves with knives or sickles. Laborers suffered injuries from carts or tools. Soldiers returned from campaigns with torn flesh, often in less than hygienic conditions. In the absence of modern antiseptics, infections frequently turned deadly. Any substance that seemed to reduce inflammation or promote healing gained attention. Bread poultices were one such substance. Healers would crush soft or slightly moldy bread and apply it directly to wounds, sometimes mixing it with honey or plant extracts. Honey, as we've seen in earlier stories, had antibacterial properties. Mold, accidentally or by chance, sometimes contributed compounds that slowed the growth of harmful microbes. The key here is observation. Medieval healers did not understand bacteria or fungi. They noticed patterns, Some wounds healed more successfully with certain applications, others became worse. These observations were recorded in notes, recipes, or oral tradition. Over time, families, monasteries, and local healers accumulated a surprisingly rich empirical knowledge about which combinations of substances were most effective. Monastic hospitals, or bimaristans, occasionally experimented in controlled ways. While bread and mold were not central in scholarly medical texts, practical experience sometimes led monks and physicians to test simple poultices. Their focus was pragmatic: comfort the patient, prevent worsening infection, and use available resources. Travelers and scholars documented such practices. For instance, some Arabic and European manuscripts include descriptions of applying soft bread mixed with plant extracts to open wounds, sometimes noting blackish or greenish substances on the bread. Though not fully understood, the recurring reports indicate a pattern of cautious experimentation with moldy materials. Meanwhile, some healers used mold in other contexts. Grains that developed surface mold could be powdered or boiled into teas for minor digestive complaints. Certain types of blue or green mold were avoided, while others were used sparingly. This trial-and-error approach created a body of knowledge that was tentative, practical, and entirely empirical. It is important to realize that this knowledge existed in parallel with other medical traditions. Herbal remedies, alcohol-based tinctures, honey, wine, and even psychoactive plants like cannabis were all part of the same environment. Healers were constantly experimenting, comparing results, and passing on observations through generations. Even failed experiments contributed indirectly, teaching what not to use or how to prepare substances more safely. The unpredictability of mold made it both a hazard and a potential blessing. Spoiled bread could cause illness if used indiscriminately. Yet, in some cases, it could slow infection or promote healing, an effect that centuries later would be recognized scientifically as antimicrobial activity. This duality, danger and potential benefit, is characteristic of much of medieval medicine. Observations were piecemeal, knowledge was localized, and treatments depended heavily on context, skill, and careful measurement. Unlike modern pharmaceuticals, medieval remedies were rarely standardized. The same recipe could produce different results depending on the quality of ingredients, environmental conditions, or even the time of year. Yet the repeated application of mold in medicinal contexts demonstrates an early and significant principle. Empirical observation can precede scientific understanding. People may stumble upon effective treatments without knowing the underlying mechanisms. This principle underlies countless discoveries throughout human history, from herbal medicine to early distillation experiments to the eventual development of antibiotics. The subtle lesson is that the messy, sometimes unclean corners of medieval life were not merely dangerous or primitive. They were laboratories of a sort, spaces where careful observation, experimentation, and adaptation quietly advanced human knowledge. Bread, mold, honey, and herbs combined in homes and monasteries formed a hidden foundation for future medical breakthroughs. Yet the story is not complete. For all the empirical knowledge about mold, the leap to understanding microbes and isolating antibiotics would require tools, experiments, and centuries that were simply unavailable in the medieval world. The question remains: how did humanity move from accidental observations in bread and poultices to the deliberate, laboratory-based discovery of penicillin and modern antibiotics? As you imagine the dimly lit kitchens and monastery infirmaries of the medieval world, it is striking to realize how much knowledge quietly accumulated without formal science. Bread, mold, and other natural substances were part of a slow, careful process of observation. Healers noticed patterns, tested remedies cautiously, and recorded their successes and failures. Centuries later, these humble practices would resonate profoundly in the laboratories of modern medicine. Medieval people did not understand microbes. Germ theory would not emerge until the 19th century. Yet the accidental use of mold in wound treatment revealed something crucial. The natural world often contains hidden compounds capable of affecting disease. By applying moldy bread to sores, using herbal poultices, or incorporating honey, medieval healers unwittingly harnessed substances that could suppress harmful microbes. Some wounds healed, others did not, but every observation contributed to the slow accumulation of practical knowledge. It was not until Alexander Fleming in 1928 that the actual mechanism of antimicrobial activity was identified. Fleming noticed that a mold contaminating a Petri dish inhibited the growth of certain bacteria, leading to the isolation of penicillin. In that moment, centuries of empirical observation were suddenly linked to scientific understanding. The mold that medieval healers had encountered in bread and grain became, in retrospect, an ancestor of one of the most revolutionary medicines in human history. The story does not end there. The medieval approach to experimentation, careful observation, cautious testing, and record-keeping reflects a timeless principle of scientific thinking. While medieval medicine lacked microscopes and controlled experiments, it established habits of inquiry that allowed knowledge to persist and evolve. Healers tested remedies, noted outcomes, and passed information through generations, creating a bridge between folk medicine and modern pharmacology. It is also worth noting the social and cultural dimensions of these discoveries. Not every healer was a scholar. Not every observation was preserved in writing. Yet in villages, towns, and monastic infirmaries, small, everyday experiments with substances like mold laid the groundwork for future breakthroughs. This highlights an important lesson. Human innovation often emerges from the margins, from the practical necessities of daily life, rather than from formalized research alone. Finally, the story of moldy bread reminds us of the interconnectedness of human experience. Across continents and centuries, people experimented with alcohol, cannabis, poppy, herbs, and mold, often without understanding the precise mechanisms behind their effects. Each substance reflects humanity's enduring quest to survive, heal, and improve life in the face of uncertainty. The same curiosity and careful observation that led medieval healers to apply mold to wounds eventually enabled scientists to isolate penicillin and transform medicine globally. As you leave this world of kitchens, wards, and mossy loaves, consider the quiet continuity of human ingenuity. Simple, everyday substances can hide profound potential. Observation, even without full understanding, can seed knowledge that centuries later revolutionizes the world. And yet, the story of medieval experimentation with natural substances continues. Beyond mold and bread, countless other plants and compounds quietly shaped daily life, medicine, and culture. One particularly influential plant in Northern Europe with a surprisingly versatile and enduring presence was the poppy, whose seeds, sap, and extracts formed the foundation of opiates used for pain relief, sleep, and medicine. The question that arises now is, how did medieval people discover the medical potential of the poppy, and how did it transform both daily life and medical practice in Europe? Story 6. The medieval poppy and the origins of opiates. Imagine walking through a northern European village in the 12th or 13th century. Fields stretch beyond the edges of timber houses. Small gardens grow herbs for cooking and medicine. And among the greenery, you notice a plant with delicate white, pink, or red flowers swaying in the breeze. This is the opium poppy Papaver somniferum, a plant whose influence on medieval life was quiet but profound. The poppy was valued for multiple reasons. Its seeds were nutritious and commonly used in cooking, sprinkled on bread, incorporated into pastries, or pressed to make oils. For ordinary households, poppy seeds provided a source of calories, flavor, and variety in an otherwise repetitive diet. But it was the sap, the latex extracted from the unripe seed pods, that held the plant's most potent properties. This sap, once dried, became a viscous substance that contained compounds capable of dulling pain, inducing sleep and affecting the mind. Medieval people were not aware of morphine, codeine, or alkaloids. They did not understand the biochemical mechanisms behind the plant's effects. Yet through observation, experimentation, and oral tradition, they discovered ways to use it medicinally. In households, small amounts of poppy sap could be mixed with wine or water to calm a sick child, ease fever, or reduce pain after minor injuries. Apothecaries in towns kept carefully prepared poultices or syrups made from poppy extract, sometimes combining it with honey, herbs, or wine to make it palatable and safer to administer. The dosage was critical. Too little had little effect. Too much could be dangerously sedating or even fatal. Monastic infirmaries also relied on the poppy for practical purposes. Monks and nuns who cared for the sick often administered opium-based remedies to patients suffering from chronic pain, wounds, or illness. Records from some European monasteries indicate careful attention to preparation, noting how much sap or tincture to combine with other ingredients to achieve the desired effect. The poppy's versatility made it an essential part of medieval pharmacology. Unlike alcohol, which was used for daily hydration and mild relief, poppy derivatives were specifically reserved for targeted medical use. Physicians recorded recipes for syrups, ointments, and tablets in medical manuscripts, sometimes labeling them for pain, cough, or sleep disorders. In addition to its medical role, the poppy occasionally appeared in cultural practices. Its seeds decorated breads and pastries for celebrations, while its flowers could be found in gardens and fields for ornamental purposes. Its presence was so pervasive that it became both familiar and practical, a plant that could sustain life, ease suffering, and bring aesthetic pleasure. The knowledge of the poppy and its uses was largely empirical. Physicians relied on observation, trial and error, and inherited knowledge from previous generations. Greek and Roman medical texts, translated into Latin, often describe the poppy's effects and preparation methods. These classical sources, combined with local experimentation, created a robust tradition of opiate medicine in medieval Europe. Yet the use of the poppy was not without risk. Overdose was possible, and misapplication could lead to dangerous sedation. Early physicians were cautious, warning that improper use could harm patients rather than heal them. Still, when used carefully, poppy-based remedies provided relief that was otherwise unavailable, particularly in an era with limited surgical options and no modern anesthesia. The medieval poppy also illustrates a larger principle. Human societies have long discovered the medicinal potential of plants through observation, experimentation, and transmission of knowledge, often without understanding the underlying science. Alcohol, cannabis, and mold, all substances we have explored in previous stories, share this pattern. The poppy adds another dimension, a plant whose chemical potency required careful handling, precise dosing, and an evolving body of practical medical knowledge. By the end of the medieval period, opiate-based remedies were firmly established in European medicine. They were included in apothecary inventories, referenced in medical texts, and passed down through generations of practitioners. Yet the plant's journey was only beginning. Its derivatives would eventually lead to more concentrated substances, spark debates about safety and morality, and profoundly shape medicine and society in the centuries to come. But even as the poppy became central to pain relief, medieval medicine faced limitations. Surgery remained rudimentary, understanding of infection was minimal, and the potential dangers of potent substances were only partially understood. This raises a subtle question that echoes throughout the history of medicine. How did societies balance the powerful effects of opiates with their risks, especially in a world without precise measurements or modern clinical knowledge? If you walk into a medieval European town, you may notice the small shops of apothecaries lining the market streets. These are places where herbs, roots, and prepared remedies are stored in jars, wooden boxes, and glass vials. Among the many substances kept behind the counter, The opium poppy is quietly present, its seeds, pods, and extracts ready to be used by the trained hand of a physician or the observant apothecary. Apothecaries were responsible not only for selling remedies but also for preparing them. This involved grinding seeds, mixing tinctures, boiling decoctions, and sometimes combining multiple ingredients into a single preparation. Opiate medicines required careful attention. Too much sap could sedate or harm a patient. Too little might have no effect. The medieval apothecary measured doses with rudimentary tools, small spoons, scaled balances, and repeated observation of patient outcomes. Physicians, too, were involved. They relied on classical texts, Greek, Roman, and Arabic medical works, as well as the practical experience of local healers. Manuscripts often provided detailed instructions. Extract a certain amount of opium, mix with wine or honey, administer in specific doses, and observe the patient carefully. These instructions reflect a medieval understanding of dosage and timing, even if the underlying chemistry was not yet understood. Pain relief in the medieval period was a pressing concern. Surgery, even minor, could be brutal and risky, and many illnesses caused significant suffering. Poppy-based remedies offered a rare solution. Applied topically in poultices, ingested as syrup, or combined with other herbs, the opiate compounds dulled pain, induced sleep, and allowed patients to endure procedures or recover more comfortably. In monasteries, hospitals, and even private households, the poppy became a tool for easing human suffering in a world with limited medical resources. Interestingly, the poppy also intersected with broader social and cultural practices. Its seeds were a food source, its flowers an ornament, its sap a medicine. Physicians sometimes debated the ethical use of opiates, weighing relief of suffering against the risk of dependency or overdose. While the concept of addiction was not fully understood, the dangers of overuse were recognized through observation. Patients who received too much opium could fall into deep sleep or fail to awaken, prompting cautious handling and careful record-keeping. Monastic hospitals played an especially important role in refining the use of poppy-based medicines. Monks documented patient reactions meticulously, noting which combinations of herbs and extracts seemed most effective. Recipes were copied, adapted, and distributed across regions, creating networks of empirical knowledge that transcended local boundaries. This allowed certain techniques to persist, evolve, and ultimately influence later pharmacology. The use of poppy in medieval medicine illustrates a broader principle. Humans have long relied on observation and empirical experimentation to discover potent remedies, often without knowing the science behind them. Just as alcohol, cannabis, and mold had roles in earlier stories, the poppy demonstrates how potency, risk, and careful management could coexist in a medieval medical system. Yet even with careful preparation, opiates were not a cure-all. They addressed pain and suffering but did not treat infection or underlying disease. Medieval medicine, while sophisticated in some respects, remained constrained by limited anatomical knowledge, rudimentary surgical techniques, and the absence of germ theory. Physicians and apothecaries learned to rely on combinations of remedies, careful dosing, and patient observation, a system that was effective in some cases, but incomplete in others. By the end of the medieval period, the poppy's importance was firmly established. It appeared in apothecary inventories, medical texts, and household remedies. Its derivatives would later evolve into laudanum, tinctures, and eventually modern opiates. The medieval approach to the poppy, careful observation, cautious experimentation, and empirical record-keeping, laid the groundwork for centuries of medicinal use, even as its risks remained partially understood. This history prompts a reflective question. In a world without modern chemistry or controlled trials, how did societies decide which potent substances to preserve, which to regulate, and which to abandon? The balance of efficacy, risk, and observation shaped the legacy of the poppy and countless other natural remedies, influencing both medicine and daily life for generations. As you imagine the medieval household or monastic infirmary, it becomes clear that the opium poppy was more than just a plant. It was a tool for survival, a source of relief, and a symbol of human ingenuity in the face of suffering. Its use spanned ordinary kitchens, apothecaries, hospitals, and even surgical theaters, quietly shaping how people endured pain in daily life. By the late medieval period, the poppy's medical applications had become standardized to a degree. Physicians and apothecaries carefully prepared syrups, poultices, and tinctures. Recipes were copied across regions, occasionally annotated with warnings about dosage or effects. Yet, despite these precautions, the plant's potency required vigilance. Misuse could sedate too deeply or, in rare cases, cause death. In this way, the poppy represented both power and responsibility. It could relieve suffering or inadvertently cause harm. Beyond its practical use, the poppy entered cultural consciousness. Its flowers appeared in art and religious symbolism, and its seeds flavored bread and pastries. Its extracts influenced medicinal thought, inspiring debate about dosage, ethics, and the management of potent substances. Across Europe, the poppy became emblematic of the delicate balance between relief and risk, medicine and morality. The medieval approach to opiates also demonstrates the interplay between observation and tradition. Physicians relied on inherited knowledge from Greek, Roman, and Arabic sources, while carefully noting local outcomes. Monastic hospitals became centers of empirical experimentation, observing patient reactions and adjusting preparations accordingly. Even without chemical analysis, medieval practitioners were methodical, understanding that human bodies respond differently depending on context, dose, and condition. The poppy's legacy extends far beyond the medieval period. Its derivatives laudanum, tinctures, and eventually modern opiates transformed pain management for centuries. Surgical practice, palliative care, and even recreational use owe a historical debt to these early discoveries. The seeds planted in kitchens, apothecaries, and monasteries became the foundation for modern pharmacology, illustrating the continuum between empirical observation and scientific advancement. Yet this story also contains cautionary notes. The same plant that could heal could also harm. Societies had to balance efficacy against potential abuse, mortality, and social consequences. The medieval experience with opiates foreshadowed later debates about regulation, ethics, and public health debates that continue into the present. Reflecting on the medieval poppy, we see a broader principle of human history. Discovery is often incremental, messy, and context-dependent. Observations made in quiet kitchens or monastery infirmaries can ripple through centuries, eventually intersecting with scientific insight, technology, and global health. Human curiosity, careful observation, and a willingness to experiment even with substances as potent as the poppy have consistently shaped our understanding of the natural world. As we leave the world of opiates behind, the narrative of medieval substances continues. Other plants, fungi, and natural compounds quietly influenced daily life and medicine. One particularly fascinating substance, widely cultivated in Asia but slowly traveling westward, is the coffee bean, a seed that would eventually transform social life, commerce, and even work habits in Europe. The next question on our slow journey through history is this: how did coffee, first consumed in the Islamic world, arrive in Europe, and what impact did it have on daily routines, trade, and culture centuries before modern cafes became ubiquitous? Story 7. Coffee, Caffeine, and the Medieval Awakening. If you imagine a traveler in the highlands of Ethiopia around the 9th or 10th century, the landscape is a mix of dense forests, terraced fields, and rugged mountains. Amidst this environment, a small, red fruit grows on shrubs in clusters. This is the coffee berry, the source of a transformative seed that will travel across continents and centuries. Legend and local tradition tell of goats that became unusually energetic after eating these berries. Observant shepherds noted that the goats leapt and danced after consuming the fruit. Local tribes experimented, roasting and brewing the berries to create a drink that kept them awake during long nights of herding or ritual practice. These early observations marked the first steps in humanity's relationship with caffeine. By the medieval period, knowledge of coffee had traveled north and east into the Arabian Peninsula. Yemen became a crucial hub in the cultivation and preparation of coffee. Here, the beans were roasted, ground, and brewed into a strong, dark beverage. Sufi mystics in cities such as Mocha used coffee during nocturnal prayers and meditative practices to maintain wakefulness and focus. Coffee quickly became more than a simple stimulant. It entered the social and religious fabric of Islamic cities. Cafes, sometimes called kave-khane, emerged as spaces for conversation, debate, music, and poetry. Patrons would gather to discuss theology, philosophy, or current events, often consuming coffee for hours at a time. These spaces became hubs of culture, intellectual exchange, and social networking, a medieval parallel to modern coffeehouses centuries later. Merchants and travelers soon learned about coffee during their journeys through Arabian ports. Ships carried roasted beans, brewing equipment, and knowledge of preparation methods along established trade routes to the Ottoman Empire, Persia, and North Africa. Alongside spices, textiles, and manuscripts, coffee traveled as both a commodity and a cultural practice. The drink's physiological effects, wakefulness, mild stimulation, and heightened focus made it remarkable. Unlike alcohol, which often sedated or intoxicated the drinker, coffee sharpened mental clarity without causing euphoria. It offered a socially acceptable way to remain alert for extended periods, whether for study, worship, or trade negotiations. By the 15th and 16th centuries, coffee had become firmly embedded in the Islamic world, particularly in cities such as Cairo, Istanbul, and Mecca. Cafes flourished, often attached to mosques or near marketplaces, where the beverage's stimulating effects complemented social and religious life. Scholars debated the morality of coffee consumption, particularly in light of its stimulating effects, but it was generally tolerated as a safe and useful substance. Coffee's journey was not just about caffeine. It also influenced trade networks, commerce, and social structures. Merchants recognized its value, creating new opportunities for cultivation, shipment, and sale. Coffee became a commodity like no other, highly desired, transportable, and capable of transforming daily routines in ways that few other substances could. Yet as coffee spread, it also sparked subtle conflicts. Religious and political authorities debated whether its stimulating effects constituted an intoxicant. Some critics feared that prolonged social gatherings fueled by coffee might encourage idle conversation or undermine moral discipline. Others embraced it as a tool for productivity, intellectual engagement, and spiritual practice. By the end of the medieval period, coffee had established itself as both a stimulant and a social phenomenon. It had traveled thousands of miles from Ethiopian hillsides to bustling cities across the Islamic world, influencing patterns of work, worship, and daily life. Its legacy demonstrates how a single plant, observed carefully, prepared thoughtfully, and shared widely, can transform human habits, social interaction, and culture over centuries. Yet even as coffee became established in the medieval Islamic world, the journey to Europe, where it would revolutionize urban life, commerce, and social practices, was only beginning. How would this wakefulness seed reshape European culture centuries later, long before the first cafes appeared in Venice or London? By the late medieval period, coffee had firmly rooted itself in the urban landscapes of the Islamic world. In cities such as Cairo, Istanbul, and Mecca, coffeehouses or kave-khane became central to social life. These were not just places to drink a stimulating beverage. They were hubs of conversation, entertainment, business, and intellectual exchange. Imagine entering a kave-khane. Wooden tables are arranged across a low-lit room, the aroma of roasted coffee beans fills the air, and men gather to discuss poetry, theology, and politics. Musicians may play, chess or backgammon may be set up on side tables, and merchants might negotiate deals while sipping small cups of bitter black coffee. For many, coffee houses provided a controlled, sober alternative to taverns and wine houses. Coffee's stimulating effects made these gatherings productive. Unlike alcohol, which often led to inebriation and disorder, caffeine sharpened mental focus and encouraged extended discussion. Patrons could stay alert for hours, engaging in debate, study, or commerce. In this way, coffee changed the rhythm of social life. No longer were nighttime conversations or intellectual discussions limited by fatigue. Coffee allowed longer, more engaged interactions. The beverage also influenced trade networks. Coffee beans, roasting methods, and brewing techniques became valuable commodities. Merchants transported them from Yemen to cities across the Ottoman Empire, Persia, and North Africa. Mocha, a port city in Yemen, emerged as a key hub, lending its name to the bean itself. The demand for coffee stimulated agriculture, commerce, and transportation, creating a specialized economy around a tiny seed. Beyond commerce, coffee began to shape intellectual and cultural norms. Sufi mystics initially adopted the beverage for nocturnal prayer sessions, but its popularity spread to scholars, poets, and ordinary citizens. Discussions in coffee houses were not limited to entertainment. They included debates about philosophy, religion, science, and governance. Coffee became a facilitator of literacy, learning, and civic engagement in cities where knowledge and discourse flourished. Yet coffee was not without controversy. Religious scholars debated whether it constituted an intoxicant or altered consciousness in ways that might contravene moral codes. Certain authorities banned its use temporarily, fearing its effects on public order or religious observance. Other scholars defended it as a permissible stimulant that supported alertness, spiritual practice, and productive work. These debates highlight the recurring medieval theme of balancing substance use with morality and social control. Interestingly, coffee also intersected with earlier patterns of substance experimentation. Like alcohol in Europe or cannabis in the Islamic world, coffee demonstrated the social and cultural negotiation surrounding novel psychoactive substances. Its effects were subtle but profound. It did not intoxicate, yet it altered daily routines, extended working hours, and influenced mental states. In this way, caffeine occupied a unique space in the continuum of medieval substances, bridging utility, culture, and mild psychoactive experience. The spread of coffee also had global implications. Merchants traveling through Mediterranean ports brought knowledge of coffee to Europe, though this process would accelerate only in the early modern period. Yet the foundational practices roasting, brewing, social consumption, and debate over use were already firmly established in the Islamic world. These practices would directly influence the European café culture that emerged in Venice, London, and Paris centuries later. By the end of the medieval period, coffee had become more than a stimulant. It was a social lubricant, a vehicle for commerce, and a cultural phenomenon. Its influence extended from the sensory taste, aroma, alertness to the societal, shaping how people gathered, discussed, and organized their lives. Yet a quiet question remains. As coffee began its journey into Europe, how would this single plant transform urban life, social structures, and the rhythms of work and leisure in ways that medieval people could scarcely have imagined? As coffee traveled westward from the bustling cities of the Islamic world, its journey began to reshape not only taste buds, but also the social and economic fabric of Europe. By the 16th and 17th centuries, travelers returning from Ottoman lands brought beans, brewing knowledge and stories of lively coffee houses to ports like Venice, Marseille, and Lisbon. Merchants, diplomats, and scholars carried the seeds, quite literally, planting the beginnings of a new cultural phenomenon. In European cities, coffee arrived at first with caution and curiosity. People were accustomed to wine, beer, and ale beverages consumed daily, sometimes in large quantities. Coffee, by contrast, was bitter, dark, and stimulating. It required preparation, roasting, grinding, and brewing. Early adopters experimented in kitchens, monasteries, and aristocratic homes, gradually discovering the rituals that would define coffee drinking for centuries. The first European cafes opened in Venice in the late 16th century. Here, the atmosphere mirrored that of the Islamic kave-khane, a place to gather, converse, debate, and exchange ideas. Coffee became a socially acceptable stimulant, an alternative to alcohol, and a medium for intellectual engagement. Patrons stayed alert, extended conversations into the evening, and engaged in commerce, philosophy, and literature. Over time, cafes became hubs of civic life, contributing to the early formation of public discourse and social networking. Merchants and entrepreneurs quickly recognized coffee's economic potential. Importation, roasting, and sale of coffee created new industries, trade routes, and commercial hubs. Ports like Amsterdam, London, and Marseille competed to secure reliable supplies, often through complex networks that spanned the Mediterranean, Red Sea, and Arabian Peninsula. Coffee, a single plant from Ethiopia and Yemen, became a commodity that connected continents and transformed trade patterns. Culturally, coffee altered daily routines. Its stimulating effects encouraged productivity, study, and conversation. Students, scholars, and workers could remain alert for longer periods, changing the rhythm of urban life. Over time, European cafes developed distinct social norms. Patrons debated politics, read newspapers, and engaged in civic activities. Coffee houses became penny universities, spaces where knowledge, discourse, and debate were democratized in ways that taverns, monasteries, or private homes could not match. Yet coffee also sparked controversy. Religious authorities and moralists debated its effects, fearing excessive stimulation or potential moral laxity. Some cities temporarily banned coffee, claiming it incited disorder or heresy. Others embraced it as a tool for clarity, focus, and social cohesion. These debates echoed earlier medieval discussions about substances like alcohol, cannabis, and opiates, demonstrating humanity's ongoing negotiation between utility, social impact, and moral considerations. The transformation from a wild berry in the Ethiopian highlands to a cultural cornerstone of European cities illustrates a recurring historical theme. The movement of substances across continents changes not only health and daily life, but also social structures, commerce, and intellectual culture. Coffee, like cannabis, poppy, or mold, shows how observation, experimentation, and cultural adaptation can transform a simple plant into a global phenomenon. By the end of the medieval period, coffee had firmly established a foothold in Europe. Its journey from Africa and Arabia foreshadowed the rise of modern trade, colonial economies, and urban culture. A single seed, roasted and brewed, reshaped how people gathered, worked, and thought quietly but profoundly. As we leave the medieval world of coffee houses, we are reminded of the subtle yet enduring influence of natural substances on human life. From stimulating discussions to new trade networks, caffeine demonstrates how curiosity, observation, and social adaptation can ripple across centuries. Yet a new question arises as we continue our journey. While coffee invigorated the mind, other substances like alcohol influenced both body and behavior in more complex ways. How did medieval societies manage the benefits and dangers of alcohol, a substance that was omnipresent, powerful, and often essential to survival? Story 8. Ale, mead, and medieval drinking culture. Step into a medieval village in northern Europe. Timber-framed houses cluster along winding streets. Smoke curls from hearths where families cook simple meals, porridge, bread, sometimes vegetables or meat if they are lucky. But one constant is almost always present: a cup of something fermented. Ale and mead were not merely beverages, they were essential parts of daily sustenance. Water, unlike today, was often unsafe to drink. Rivers and wells could carry contaminants, leading to dysentery and other illnesses. Fermented drinks offered a safer alternative. The brewing process, boiling, fermenting, sometimes spicing, killed pathogens and made liquids digestible. For adults and children alike, ale or small quantities of mead could constitute a significant portion of daily caloric intake. Ale made from barley, water, and sometimes hops was the most common drink. Households often brewed their own, and recipes varied from region to region. Mead, fermented from honey and water, was considered a sweeter and sometimes stronger alternative, often reserved for special occasions or the wealthier segments of society. Both beverages were low in alcohol content compared to modern standards, but enough to provide mild relaxation and warmth, particularly in cold climates. In cities, brewing was both domestic and commercial. Taverns and alehouses sold beverages to those who could not brew at home, serving as communal hubs for news, gossip, and entertainment. Monks in monasteries often brewed their own ale, both to provide sustenance for themselves and to sell or distribute to the surrounding community. Brewing was an art as well as a science, involving careful timing, temperature management, and attention to fermentation. The nutritional aspect of fermented drinks cannot be overstated. Ale contained calories, vitamins, and minerals absent from a meager medieval diet. Mead offered similar benefits, with the added energy from honey. For peasants and workers, these drinks were not luxuries. They were a reliable source of hydration and sustenance, often consumed multiple times per day. Socially, ale and mead were central to gatherings, celebrations, and rituals. Weddings, harvest festivals, and religious feast days often featured communal drinking. The act of sharing a vessel or cup strengthened bonds and reinforced communal norms. Drinking was as much about social cohesion as it was about quenching thirst. Yet medieval drinking culture was not without risks. Excessive consumption could lead to illness, accidents, or moral concerns. Authorities, from local lords to church leaders, often regulated alehouses, set prices, or imposed limits on brewing to maintain social order. Even so, fermented beverages were deeply embedded in the fabric of daily life, a practical necessity entwined with pleasure, community, and survival. Brewing itself reflects human ingenuity in harnessing natural processes. Early brewers learned to cultivate yeast, manage fermentation, and combine ingredients for taste and longevity. Like the use of cannabis, poppy, or mold, brewing demonstrates the empirical experimentation that characterized medieval approaches to food, medicine, and comfort. Each batch of ale or mead was a subtle experiment, varying strength, flavor, and effect, learned through observation and repetition. In this context, alcohol was both medicine and daily sustenance. Mildly fermented ale could ease stomach ailments or provide warmth during illness. Stronger meads or ales were reserved for feasts, offering celebration and communal bonding. The line between nourishment, recreation, and medicine was often blurred, and medieval people navigated it with practical experience rather than scientific theory. Yet a question lingers as we consider this daily liquid diet. How did medieval societies balance the nourishing and social benefits of alcohol with its potential to harm individuals or disrupt social order? The tension between utility and risk would shape regulations, social norms, and even economic practices surrounding brewing for centuries to come. Step inside a medieval town, and the smell of malt, yeast, and fermenting barley fills the air. Brewing was both a household necessity and a thriving trade. Every household brewed ale, often twice daily, not just for taste but for survival. These liquids were nutritious, slightly alcoholic, and safe to drink in a time when water could carry dangerous pathogens. Household brewing involved careful attention. Barley or other grains were soaked, roasted, and mashed to release sugars, then boiled and left to ferment. Hops, which arrived later in Northern Europe, were occasionally added to stabilize and flavor the beverage. Yeast worked invisibly, converting sugars to alcohol, though medieval brewers did not understand the science behind it. Success depended on experience, observation, and sometimes luck. Over-fermentation could ruin a batch, while insufficient fermentation could result in sour or flat drinks. Monasteries played an essential role in refining brewing techniques. Monks experimented systematically, combining different grains, herbs, and fermentation methods to improve flavor, alcohol content, and longevity. Brewing was part of monastic labor, both for sustenance and for trade. Monasteries often sold surplus ale or mead, generating income that funded religious, educational, and charitable activities. In towns, alehouses and taverns served as centers of community life. Workers, merchants, and travelers gathered to drink, socialize, and conduct business. These establishments became informal hubs for exchanging news, debating politics, and sharing local gossip. Ale was the lifeblood of daily routines consumed at breakfast, dinner, or during work breaks, connecting individuals in both private and public spheres. Trade in alcoholic beverages expanded regionally and even internationally. Honey, the basis of mead, was traded from rural areas to urban centers. Malted barley moved from agricultural villages to brewing hubs. Hops were imported from distant regions. Prices and quality varied, creating both opportunities and challenges for brewers and consumers. Regulations, taxes, and licensing ensured some control over this vital trade, balancing profit with social stability. Alcohol's effects were carefully observed and sometimes used medicinally. Mild ale could soothe the stomach, warm the body, or provide calories for the sick. Stronger beverages were sometimes administered to ease pain, calm nerves, or help patients sleep. Like cannabis, poppy, or coffee, alcohol straddled the line between utility, medicine, and social stimulation. It demanded knowledge, moderation, and community awareness to avoid harm. Yet alcohol's ubiquity brought tensions. Overconsumption could lead to disorder, illness, or violence. Authorities, both secular and ecclesiastical, attempted to regulate drinking, limiting tavern hours, controlling prices, or punishing public drunkenness. Moral debates raged about the role of alcohol in everyday life, particularly among the clergy and scholars. Despite these concerns, fermented beverages remained indispensable, a daily food source, a cultural touchstone, and a vital social lubricant. The practices surrounding ale and mead also reflect medieval empirical knowledge. Brewers experimented with grains, additives, and fermentation techniques, observing which methods produced desirable flavors or stronger alcohol content. These experiments were passed down through families, monasteries, and guilds, creating a cumulative body of practical knowledge. In many ways, the medieval approach to alcohol mirrors how societies experimented with cannabis, poppy, and mold. Through observation, trial and error, and careful transmission of experience. By the end of the medieval period, fermented beverages had become deeply intertwined with daily life, trade, culture, and medicine. Alehouses, mead halls, and monastic breweries shaped urban and rural economies, social norms, and even political life. Drinking culture was not mere indulgence. It was embedded in survival, community cohesion, and human ingenuity. Yet a question persists. How did medieval societies reconcile the benefits of alcohol nourishment, social cohesion, and mild medicinal use with the very real risks of overconsumption, dependence, and social disruption? This tension would shape regulations, traditions, and cultural attitudes toward alcohol for centuries to come. As the medieval world matured, ale and mead were no longer just beverages. They had become a central pillar of daily life, social organization, and economic activity. In towns and villages across northern Europe, the processes of brewing, trading, and consuming alcohol shaped routines, festivals, and communal interactions. Authorities recognized the dual nature of these beverages, essential for survival, yet capable of fostering disorder. Regulations emerged to balance these effects. Local lords and city councils often controlled who could brew, where taverns could operate, and the hours during which alcohol could be served. Licensing systems ensured quality control, taxed production, and mitigated risks associated with overconsumption. In some regions, the church weighed in, admonishing excessive indulgence while acknowledging alcohol's necessity for nourishment, ritual, and medicine. Monasteries continue to play a crucial role. Monks refined brewing techniques, creating recipes that balanced flavor, shelf life, and alcohol content. Surplus ale or mead was sold, supporting charitable works, education, and religious missions. The monastic approach to brewing reflected both practical necessity and methodical experimentation, demonstrating how medieval institutions combined observation, discipline, and long-term thinking to manage complex substances. Festivals, religious celebrations, and communal feasts were inseparable from ale and mead. Harvest festivals, weddings, and religious holidays often featured communal drinking, reinforcing social bonds and providing structured opportunities for indulgence. Drinking was ritualized, guided by norms about moderation, respect, and shared participation. In this way, alcohol acted as both sustenance and social glue, structuring time, space, and community interactions. Daily life also depended on fermented beverages in subtle ways. Peasants, artisans, and laborers relied on ale or mead as a source of calories and hydration. For children, small amounts of weak ale were sometimes safer than contaminated water. The beverages contributed to nutrition, energy, and general well-being, quietly sustaining populations in ways often overlooked by modern observers. Alcohol's duality, nourishing yet potentially disruptive, mirrors a broader medieval pattern. Substances like cannabis, opiates, coffee, and even mold illustrate the same tension. The same plant or product could heal, energize, or nourish, while also posing risks if misused. Navigating these effects required observation, experimentation, regulation, and social norm skills that shaped medieval medical, cultural, and economic systems. The influence of ale and mead extended far beyond medieval villages. Brewing knowledge laid the foundation for early modern industries, guilds, and commercial enterprises. Taverns evolved into social hubs, influencing urban culture, political discussion, and public discourse. The ritualized consumption of alcohol helped shape communal identity, establishing traditions that endure in festivals, pubs, and celebrations even today. Yet even as ale and mead sustained communities, questions remained about moderation, governance, and social impact. Balancing nourishment, social cohesion, and public order was a continuous challenge. These tensions would echo into the early modern period, influencing laws, trade policies, and cultural attitudes toward alcohol for centuries. Looking back, medieval drinking culture teaches us a subtle yet enduring lesson. Human societies have long relied on the careful integration of potent substances into daily life, balancing utility, pleasure, and risk. Fermented beverages were more than indulgence. They were sustenance, medicine, social glue, and economic resource. Understanding how medieval people navigated this balance offers insight into the broader story of human interaction with natural substances, a story that continues with caffeine, cannabis, opiates, and countless other compounds. As we leave the taverns, mead halls, and village kitchens, another question quietly arises. While ale and mead dominated Northern Europe, other regions relied on fermented fruit, rice, and honey in equally vital ways. How did these alternative fermented beverages shape societies elsewhere, and what lessons might they offer about adaptation, survival, and cultural identity? Story 9. Fermented fruits, rice, and honey across medieval cultures. If you travel across medieval Asia, Africa, and Europe, one thing becomes clear. Humans everywhere discovered fermentation as a way to preserve calories, enhance flavor, and produce mildly intoxicating beverages. While Northern Europe relied heavily on barley-based ales and honey-based meads, other regions developed unique drinks from fruits, rice, and local ingredients, beverages that were equally vital to daily life. social structures, and cultural rituals. In East Asia, particularly in China and Japan, rice became a primary ingredient for fermented beverages. Rice wine, known in China as jiu, had been produced for centuries and was integral to both domestic and ritual contexts. The process involved steaming rice, allowing naturally occurring or cultivated molds and yeasts to convert starches into sugars, and then fermenting the mixture into an alcoholic liquid. The result varied in strength and flavor depending on grain quality, temperature, and fermentation time. Rice wine was more than a drink. It was woven into social and ceremonial life. Festivals, weddings, and ancestral rituals often required specific types of fermented beverages, with attention paid to taste, color, and aroma. Consumption was regulated by age, status, and occasion. For common households, rice wine provided calories, warmth, and hydration, much like ale in Northern Europe. For elites, it served as a marker of refinement, culture, and hospitality. In Africa, indigenous peoples developed fermentation methods suited to local crops, such as millet, sorghum, and palm sap. In West Africa, millet beers provided essential nutrients and energy for agricultural communities. Palm wine, tapped from the sap of palm trees, was widely consumed across tropical regions. Fermentation transformed these liquids into safe, mildly alcoholic beverages that were central to both daily life and ceremonial events. Palm wine, for example, was often shared communally during marriages, initiations, and political negotiations, reinforcing social bonds and hierarchies. In the Mediterranean and Middle Eastern worlds, fruits such as grapes, dates, and figs were fermented into wine or syrup-based alcoholic beverages. Monastic vineyards in regions like Italy, Spain, and France refined grape fermentation techniques, producing wines that sustained both the monks themselves and the wider community through trade. Grapes and dates were also fermented into sweet, fortified beverages that combined nutritional value, medicinal properties, and social function. Honey, already familiar to European societies as the basis of mead, was fermented in various regions to produce both alcoholic beverages and medicinal preparations. In parts of Scandinavia, the Middle East, and North Africa, honey meads were flavored with herbs, spices, or fruit, reflecting both local tastes and medicinal beliefs. The alcohol content and sweetness were carefully controlled, as these beverages were consumed daily and also offered therapeutic effects, such as easing digestion, reducing pain, or calming feverish patients. Across these regions, a common principle emerges. Fermentation transformed raw, perishable ingredients into safe, calorically dense, and socially valuable products. These beverages were versatile: part nutrition, part medicine, part ritual, and part social glue. They reflected human ingenuity in adapting to environmental constraints, preserving resources, and meeting both practical and cultural needs. Yet each region adapted fermentation to local conditions. In East Asia, molds and yeasts were carefully cultivated for rice fermentation. In Africa, ambient yeasts and bacteria shaped the taste of millet and palm beverages. In the Mediterranean, grape fermentation relied on sunny climates and skilled viniculture. These variations demonstrate a pattern of empirical experimentation. Humans observed, tested, and refined processes over generations, producing regionally distinct yet functionally similar products. Even in everyday households, the production and consumption of fermented beverages required attention, skill, and knowledge. Temperature control, container selection, timing, and ingredient quality all mattered. Mistakes could produce sour, spoiled, or unsafe beverages, while successful fermentation created nourishment, enjoyment, and social cohesion. Through observation and repetition, practical knowledge accumulated, forming the foundation for more sophisticated brewing and fermentation practices in later centuries. As we consider this global landscape, one question emerges. Across different continents, fermented beverages shared common purposes: nutrition, safety, social cohesion, yet were made from vastly different ingredients. How did these diverse fermentation traditions influence trade, cultural exchange, and the spread of knowledge between distant societies? By the medieval period, fermented beverages had become a staple across much of the known world, yet their impact extended far beyond daily sustenance. Trade routes carried not only goods, but also knowledge of fermentation techniques, creating a web of cultural and technological exchange. In East Asia, rice wine techniques were shared and refined over centuries. Merchants, scholars, and travelers carried knowledge along the Silk Road, introducing fermentation methods to Central Asia and beyond. Recipes, molds, and even small vessels used for fermentation were transported across regions. Local adaptations occurred. Grains other than rice were sometimes substituted, additional flavorings were added, and techniques were adjusted to suit environmental conditions. The result was a rich, evolving body of practical knowledge about fermentation, storage, and consumption. Africa's fermentation practices similarly intersected with trade. Palm wine and millet beers were not only consumed locally, but also exchanged along trans-Saharan routes. Traders carried palm wine as both a sustenance item and a gift commodity. The beverages influenced social relations, diplomatic exchanges, and ceremonial practices across communities separated by hundreds of miles. Knowledge of timing, fermentation, and preservation traveled with people, demonstrating that practical experimentation often spread faster than formal scholarly writing. In the Mediterranean, grape-based wines were central to commerce and cultural exchange. Monastic vineyards refined production methods, which were then shared with local farmers and exported across Europe. The wine trade facilitated economic growth, urban development, and even political alliances. Wine also acted as a medium of knowledge transfer. Travelers brought back techniques for barrel storage, fermentation timing, and blending grapes, contributing to an increasingly sophisticated understanding of viniculture. Honey meads and fruit-based alcoholic beverages had their own global impact. Middle Eastern merchants introduced date wines, spiced meads, and syrup-based fermented drinks to Mediterranean markets. European apothecaries experimented with these ingredients, combining them with local honey, herbs, and fruits to create new variations. These exchanges illustrate a subtle but profound truth. Empirical knowledge about fermentation observation, experimentation, and refinement was portable, even in the absence of formal scientific frameworks. Fermentation also shaped social and cultural structures. In every region, these beverages were integral to rituals, celebrations, and daily routines. Communal drinking reinforced social hierarchies, cemented alliances, and marked the passage of time through festivals and religious ceremonies. Across continents, fermented beverages were simultaneously practical, medicinal, and symbolic, reflecting human ingenuity in adapting natural resources to multiple roles. The economic implications were equally significant. Brewing and fermentation created markets for raw ingredients, specialized tools, and skilled labor. Artisans, traders, and brewers contributed to local economies and to long-distance trade networks. Techniques that originated in one region, a specific method for fermenting rice, a particular blend of spices in mead, or an optimized fermentation container could travel vast distances, influencing production in far-off lands. Yet the global spread of fermentation knowledge was not uniform. Regional climates, available ingredients, and social norms shaped the adoption and adaptation of techniques. What worked in Japan for rice wine might not suit the African tropics or northern Europe's barley fields. Nevertheless, the underlying principle remained consistent. Careful observation, experimentation, and transmission of practical knowledge allowed societies to harness fermentation for sustenance, pleasure, and culture. This expansive network of fermented beverages underscores a broader pattern in human history. Practical experimentation with natural substances, whether in food, medicine, or psychoactive compounds, transcends local boundaries and can have global consequences. The exchange of fermentation techniques anticipated later global movements of other substances, coffee, tea, spices, and eventually sugar, all of which reshaped economies, cultures, and daily life. And yet, a question lingers. While fermentation provided nourishment, pleasure, and social cohesion, it could also intoxicate, disrupt social norms, or pose health risks. How did societies across different continents manage the delicate balance between utility, pleasure, and potential harm in fermented beverages? By the late medieval period, fermented beverages had become integral to the social, economic, and cultural life of communities worldwide. Whether it was rice wine in East Asia, palm wine and millet beers in Africa, or mead and fruit wines in Europe and the Middle East, these beverages served multiple purposes: sustenance, ritual, medicine, and social cohesion. Yet their potency required careful management. Communities developed norms and regulations to balance the benefits and risks of alcohol. In East Asia, drinking rituals were codified, distinguishing everyday consumption from ceremonial use. Rice wine might accompany offerings to ancestors, weddings, or religious festivals, while overconsumption was discouraged to maintain moral and social order. In African societies, elders and chiefs oversaw communal drinking, ensuring that palm wine or millet beers reinforced hierarchy, tradition, and ceremonial practice rather than chaos. In Europe, alehouses, taverns, and monastic breweries were subject to licensing, taxation, and local regulation. Authorities recognized that fermented beverages were essential for nutrition, particularly for children and laborers, yet excessive consumption threatened social stability. Rules governing sale hours, pricing, and serving practices reflected the delicate balance between utility and potential harm. Even religious institutions navigated this tension, acknowledging alcohol's role in liturgy, medicine, and daily sustenance, while cautioning against moral and social consequences of overindulgence. The ritual and symbolic importance of fermented beverages cannot be overstated. Across continents, these drinks marked life stages, seasonal cycles, and communal identity. Harvest festivals in Africa and Europe often revolved around newly brewed beers and meads. Weddings and initiation rites incorporated fermented beverages as essential markers of transition. Rice wine in East Asia accompanied festivals, ancestral veneration, and scholarly gatherings. In every case, the act of drinking was embedded in cultural and spiritual frameworks, reinforcing norms, relationships, and continuity across generations. Economic impact was also profound. Fermentation stimulated local and long-distance trade, creating markets for raw ingredients, vessels, and expertise. Merchants, brewers, and apothecaries were integral to these networks, and innovations in fermentation techniques spread through observation, apprenticeship, and travel. The exchange of practical knowledge about brewing, preservation, and flavoring contributed to global patterns of economic and cultural interaction long before industrialization. Furthermore, these beverages demonstrated early empirical experimentation. Across regions, humans refined fermentation through trial and error, observation, and careful record-keeping. Adjusting temperature, timing, ingredient proportions, and storage methods allowed brewers to optimize flavor, potency, and safety. This experimentation laid the groundwork for more formalized scientific study centuries later. Yet the risks persisted. Alcohol intoxication, spoilage, and uneven fermentation could harm health or disrupt social order. Societies mitigated these dangers through cultural norms, regulation, and careful observation. The balance achieved reflects a recurring theme in medieval substance use. Humans recognized the duality of potent natural products, their benefits and their hazards, and adapted accordingly. By the end of the medieval period, fermented beverages had become indispensable worldwide. They sustained populations, shaped social structures, facilitated trade, and fostered cultural rituals. Rice wines, millet beers, palm wines meads, and fruit wines all contributed to human survival, ingenuity, and community cohesion. Moreover, they exemplify a broader pattern. Observation, experimentation, and adaptation allowed societies to harness natural substances, laying foundations for both local and global cultural evolution. As we leave the world of fermented beverages, another question emerges. Humans experimented not only with fermentation, but also with psychoactive and medicinal plant substances that altered perception, eased pain, or stimulated energy. How did societies navigate the use of these powerful plants, balancing efficacy, risk, and social norms, especially when knowledge was empirical rather than scientific? Story 10. Cannabis, Herbs, and the Medieval Mind-Altering Arsenal. Picture a medieval apothecary shop in a bustling town. Wooden shelves are lined with jars of dried leaves, roots, flowers, and powders. Among these is a substance that would have seemed unusual to most: cannabis. Known by different names across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, this plant was recognized for its ability to alter perception, calm pain, and sometimes induce sleep. Yet it was just one among many plants that medieval societies explored for their psychoactive or medicinal properties. Cannabis, often referred to as hemp when cultivated for fiber or ganja, and bang in Asian contexts, had multiple uses. Its fibers were essential for ropes, sails, and textiles, while its seeds provided nutrition. But it was the leaves and resin that were most notable for altering the mind. Herbalists and physicians experimented with these substances, often combining them with alcohol, honey, or other herbs to maximize their effects while mitigating unpleasant side effects. In addition to cannabis, medieval practitioners utilized a range of mind-altering plants. Valerian, used for sleep; belladonna for its sedative and hallucinogenic properties; mandrake, prized for both pain relief and mystical association; and henbane, used in small doses to treat pain or induce trance-like states. These substances were often integrated into complex recipes, reflecting careful observation, empirical experimentation, and accumulated knowledge passed through generations. Monastic infirmaries were particularly important centers for experimentation. While the church maintained strict oversight over moral behavior, monks carefully documented herbal remedies for both physical and psychological ailments. Cannabis and other herbs were sometimes included in poultices, teas, and tinctures, administered to relieve pain, calm nerves, or induce rest. The effects were unpredictable, and dosage was a critical concern. Excessive use could lead to hallucinations, nausea, or even death. Across different regions, cultural attitudes towards psychoactive plants varied. In the Islamic world, hashish and related preparations were known and sometimes regulated due to religious concerns. In Asia, cannabis was integrated into medical, ritual, and daily life, particularly in India and China, where knowledge of its preparation and dosing was extensive. In Europe, skepticism and fascination coexisted. Some authorities condemned its use, while physicians cautiously applied it for legitimate medical purposes. The practical use of these plants reveals a common medieval pattern: empirical knowledge developed through observation, experimentation, and careful transmission. People did not know the chemical mechanisms underlying the effects, but they recognized outcomes. They observed which plants calmed pain, induced sleep, or altered consciousness, and they experimented with preparation methods, dosages, and combinations. Successful techniques spread through manuscripts, oral tradition, and apprenticeship, creating a body of knowledge that could persist for centuries. Cannabis and other mind-altering plants were also socially and ritually significant. In some cultures, they were used to facilitate meditation, religious ceremonies, or shamanic practices. In others, their effects were incorporated into medical treatment, sleep aids, or remedies for mental distress. These practices illustrate that the boundaries between medicine, ritual, and recreation were often fluid in medieval life. Yet despite centuries of use, many questions remained unanswered. How much was safe? How could different plants be combined for desired effects without causing harm? How did societies reconcile the benefits of these substances with their potential to disrupt social order or mental stability? These uncertainties highlight the challenges medieval practitioners faced when working with potent, poorly understood natural compounds. As we consider this arsenal of medieval herbs and psychoactive plants, one question emerges. How did the careful empirical experimentation with cannabis, henbane, mandrake, and similar substances influence both medical practice and cultural attitudes toward mind-altering plants in later centuries? In medieval towns and monasteries, cannabis and other mind-altering herbs occupied a careful middle ground between medicine, ritual, and curiosity. Physicians, apothecaries, and herbalists relied on observation to determine how these plants could be safely and effectively used, while avoiding the social and spiritual dangers they posed. Cannabis was primarily valued for pain relief and sedation. Leaves or resin were mixed into poultices to ease muscular aches or joint pain, combined with wine to soothe internal discomfort, or infused in oils to prepare ointments for burns or wounds. Medieval texts, such as Arabic medical manuscripts translated into Latin, included instructions for preparation and dosage, emphasizing moderation and patient observation. The same plant that could relieve suffering could also induce hallucination or lethargy if misused. Other herbs like mandrake and henbane were similarly double-edged. Mandrake roots, often anthropomorphized in folklore, contained compounds that could relieve pain or induce sleep, but were toxic in high doses. Henbane leaves and seeds were used in poultices, inhaled smoke, or mixed into medicinal syrups. These substances were carefully titrated, reflecting a sophisticated empirical understanding. The practitioner could not see the chemical effects, but they could measure results through observation. Monasteries and apothecaries became centers of experimentation. Here, herbalists documented patient reactions, refined extraction techniques, and noted combinations that enhanced efficacy while minimizing danger. Cannabis might be blended with wine and honey to produce a gentle sedative. Henbane might be combined with valerian for sleep. Mandrake could be carefully dosed in topical ointments for surgery or childbirth. These combinations reflected centuries of accumulated knowledge, transmitted via manuscripts, apprenticeship, and oral tradition. Social and cultural boundaries also shaped the use of these herbs. In the Islamic world, hashish use was monitored and sometimes restricted due to religious prohibitions, yet it persisted for medical or mystical purposes. In Europe, the church discouraged recreational use, but medicinal applications were tolerated. Knowledge of preparation and safe administration became a mark of expertise, with practitioners navigating ethical, moral, and social constraints alongside practical effectiveness. In addition to individual health, these substances influenced broader social practices. Cannabis, henbane, and mandrake were sometimes incorporated into rituals designed to induce trance, meditation, or altered states. These rituals blurred the line between medicine and spiritual practice, demonstrating the multifaceted role of psychoactive plants in medieval life. The cultural significance reinforced caution. The same substances that could heal could also destabilize mental states or social cohesion if misused. Trade networks facilitated the spread of knowledge about these herbs. Seeds, roots, and manuscripts traveled across continents, allowing techniques developed in one region to influence distant communities. For example, medicinal uses of cannabis observed in the Middle East informed European herbal manuals, while Asian preparations inspired alternative remedies. Practical experimentation was portable, and empirical knowledge crossed cultural and geographic boundaries, sometimes centuries ahead of scientific chemistry. Yet the unpredictable nature of these substances always posed questions. How could practitioners standardize dosing? How would they balance patient care with social norms and religious beliefs? How could they transmit knowledge reliably without risking misuse? These questions illustrate a recurring medieval challenge. Powerful natural compounds offered both tremendous benefits and significant risks, and managing this tension required experience, observation, and communal wisdom. By the end of the medieval period, cannabis, henbane, mandrake, and similar plants had firmly established a role in medicine, ritual, and social life. They reflected the ingenuity, caution, and experimentation that defined medieval approaches to natural substances. Yet they also foreshadowed the challenges future societies would face as chemistry and pharmacology evolved, challenges of dosage, ethics, and cultural acceptance that remain relevant even today. This leads to a broader question. As societies explored plants for altered states and medicinal purposes, they simultaneously developed practices to monitor, regulate, and transmit knowledge safely. But what happened when a plant was so powerful, dangerous, or culturally controversial that it could not be safely integrated into everyday life? As medieval societies engaged with cannabis, mandrake, henbane, and other mind-altering plants, a delicate balance emerged between utility, risk, and social control. These herbs offered medicinal relief, ritual significance, and even mild recreational effects, but they could also be dangerous, unpredictable, or morally contested. Managing these risks required observation, regulation, and careful transmission of knowledge. Monastic and apothecary systems became key centers of control. Monks meticulously documented the preparation, dosing, and effects of psychoactive plants, sometimes recording both successes and failures. Apothecaries acted as mediators, ensuring that potent preparations were used appropriately, often limiting access to trained practitioners. Manuals and herbal texts, copied and circulated across Europe and the Islamic world, codified techniques, warnings, and indications, preserving empirical knowledge for future generations. The cultural context shaped both practice and perception. In Islamic regions, hashish and cannabis were subject to legal and religious scrutiny, often tolerated in medical and mystical contexts but condemned recreationally. In Europe, the Church maintained strict moral oversight, condemning excessive indulgence but permitting medicinal applications. In each case, social norms, religious beliefs, and practical necessity intersected to determine how and when these substances could be used. Medical experimentation continued to refine understanding. Practitioners observed patient responses carefully, adjusting dosage, preparation, and delivery methods. Cannabis-infused poultices were tested for pain relief, mandrake preparations for surgery, henbane syrups for sleep. This empirical approach emphasized outcomes over theoretical understanding. Practitioners rarely knew the chemical compounds responsible for effects, but they recognized patterns, risks, and optimal applications. The knowledge gained during the medieval period laid the foundation for later pharmacology. Early modern apothecaries and physicians built upon these empirical observations, eventually isolating active compounds and standardizing dosing. Yet the medieval approach, careful observation, meticulous record-keeping, and cautious experimentation demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of human physiology, plant chemistry, and social constraints long before the rise of laboratory science. At the same time, these substances exemplified societal tension. Their potency could threaten social order, induce unpredictable effects, or provoke moral panic. Medieval authorities constantly negotiated access, balancing the benefits of medicinal and ritual use against the potential for harm. These dynamics foreshadowed future debates about controlled substances, ethics, and public health. Culturally, psychoactive plants reinforced the multifaceted nature of medieval life. They were tools for survival, healing, spiritual practice, and intellectual exploration. They were markers of knowledge, skill, and social responsibility, distinguishing trained practitioners from laypeople. Their careful use reflected broader principles: empirical experimentation, transmission of knowledge, and negotiation between human ambition and natural limits. By the close of the medieval period, Cannabis and similar herbs had secured a lasting role in both medicine and culture. They demonstrated the capacity of human societies to harness potent natural substances thoughtfully, blending observation, experience, and regulation to achieve practical benefits while mitigating risks. Their story is a testament to human ingenuity, caution, and adaptability, a pattern repeated across time with opiates, alcohol, coffee, and countless other compounds. Yet a new question emerges as we leave the medieval mind-altering arsenal. While societies experimented with and regulated individual substances, what happened when multiple potent compounds were combined, whether in medicine, ritual, or daily life? And how did medieval humans navigate the interactions, synergies, and dangers of complex mixtures?